The storm was supposed to pass by midnight. It didn't. Instead, it swallowed a corporate jet carrying 12 souls somewhere over the mountains, and when the distress call finally broke through the static at 11:47 p.m., screaming through a lobby speaker in desperate coded aviation language, everyone in that billion-dollar skyscraper stood frozen. Everyone except the man pushing the mop bucket. The janitor's head snapped up, his eyes locked onto the phone. And then he spoke, calm, precise, impossible, answering in perfect aviation protocol that shouldn't exist in the mouth of a man wearing a custodial uniform. That's when Cassandra Whitmore realized she had no idea who this man really was. If you want to see how a single moment can rewrite an entire life, stay until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this reaches. The rain didn't fall that night. It attacked. It hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Meridian Tower's lobby with a violence that made even the glass seem fragile, each droplet exploding on contact like tiny grenades in an endless barrage. The wind howled through the plaza outside, bending the young trees planted by the landscaping company into shapes they were never meant to hold. Lightning split the sky every few seconds, illuminating downtown in stark white flashes that made the whole city look like a crime scene photograph. Inside the lobby was a cathedral of marble and steel, 70 feet high, with a massive abstract sculpture suspended from the ceiling that was supposed to represent innovation or synergy or whatever concept the overpaid artist had pitched to the board. The floors gleamed like black mirrors. The reception desk curved across the far wall like a crescent moon carved from Italian marble that cost more than most people's houses. And at 11:34 p.m., the entire space was nearly empty. Nearly. Ethan Walker pushed his cleaning cart across the polished floor, the wheels squeaking softly in a rhythm he'd long stopped hearing. The cart held the usual suspects: spray bottles of industrial cleaner that smelled like artificial lemons and chemical warfare, microfiber cloths in various states of use, trash bags, a mop that had seen better days, and a radio that only picked up two stations: classic rock and static. Tonight, it was plain static. Ethan didn't mind the quiet. After 5 years of working the graveyard shift at Meridian Tower, he'd learned to appreciate the silence. During the day, this lobby was a chaos of executives in expensive suits, assistants clutching tablets like holy relics, delivery people hauling packages, tourists taking photos of the sculpture they didn't understand. The noise was constant, overwhelming, exhausting. But at night? At night, the building belonged to people like him, the invisible ones. The cleaners, the security guards, the maintenance workers who kept the gleaming facade functioning while everyone else slept. Ethan was 32 years old, though he felt older most days. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with the kind of broad shoulders that came from years of physical work, not from a gym membership. His dark hair was starting to show threads of premature gray at the temples, and his face had the weathered quality of someone who'd seen more of life than he'd wanted to. His custodial uniform was navy blue and eternally wrinkled, no matter how carefully he tried to iron it at home. His name tag was crooked. It always was. He moved with a slight hitch in his step, favoring his left side in a way that most people wouldn't notice unless they watched carefully. His right shoulder sat just a fraction higher than his left, a permanent reminder of injuries that no amount of physical therapy had fully corrected. But Ethan Walker had learned to live with permanent reminders. He was wiping down the glass doors near the north entrance when he heard voices behind him. "Don't care what the tower is saying, Marcus. The plane should have landed 40 minutes ago." Ethan didn't turn around. He'd learned years ago that the executives who worked in this building looked through people like him, not at them. Turning around would only make things awkward. He recognized the voice, though. Everyone who worked in Meridian Tower recognized that voice. Cassandra Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Global Ventures. 30 years old. Self-made billionaire. Featured on the cover of Forbes 3 times. Known for taking her father's failing real estate company and transforming it into an international conglomerate with divisions in aviation, technology, renewable energy, and half a dozen other industries that Ethan couldn't keep track of. She was standing near the reception desk, phone pressed to her ear, her other hand gesturing sharply as she spoke. Even at this hour, even in the middle of a crisis, she looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that probably had a French name. Her suit was charcoal gray and perfectly tailored. Her heels were sharp enough to be classified as weapons. "I understand there's a storm," she said into the phone, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "What I don't understand is why we've lost contact with our aircraft. The flight plan was filed. The pilots are experienced. The plane has every safety system known to aviation. So tell me, Marcus, how does a $15 million jet just disappear?" Ethan kept wiping the glass, moving to the next door panel. Not his business. He had 3 more floors to clean before his shift ended at 6 a.m., and getting involved in executive drama was a guaranteed way to make his night longer. Behind him, Cassandra's voice rose slightly. "What do you mean you don't know? You're the director of—" She stopped, listening. Yes, I'll hold." There was a pause. Ethan could hear her heels clicking against the marble as she paced. "This is unacceptable," she muttered, not quite to herself. "Completely unacceptable." More clicking. Then she spoke again, presumably to someone else who'd joined her. "Andrew, tell me you have something." "Still nothing from air traffic control," a male voice responded. Ethan glanced over briefly. A younger man in an expensive suit, probably one of Cassandra's assistants, holding a tablet. "Last confirmed position was over the Cascades, but that was 53 minutes ago. The storm front moved in faster than projected. Visibility is near zero. The emergency transponder? Not responding. Could be weather interference, or what?" The assistant hesitated. "Or it's been damaged." The lobby fell silent except for the rain hammering the windows. Ethan finished with the glass doors and moved his cart toward the elevators, trying to make himself even more invisible than usual. This was clearly a bad night for Whitmore Global Ventures, and the last thing anyone needed was a janitor eavesdropping on a corporate crisis. "Get me the FAA," Cassandra said suddenly. "I don't care who you have to wake up. I want every resource we have focused on finding that plane." "Already in progress," the assistant replied. "But given the weather conditions and the terrain—" "I know the terrain, Andrew. I know exactly what's out there. That's why we need to find them now." Ethan was halfway to the elevators when Cassandra's phone rang. She answered immediately. "This is Whitmore." Yes, go ahead." Then her expression changed. It was subtle. She was clearly someone who'd mastered the art of controlling her reactions, but Ethan saw it anyway. Her eyes widened just slightly, her shoulders tensed. "Say that again," she said quietly. The voice on the other end spoke, but Ethan couldn't hear the words. He watched as Cassandra's free hand reached out to steady herself against the reception desk. "When?" she asked. "How long ago?" More inaudible responses. "And the signal strength?" A pause. "Keep this line open," Cassandra said. "I don't care if it's just static. You keep it open. We might—" She was interrupted by a sudden burst of noise from her phone, loud enough that Ethan could hear it from 20 feet away. It wasn't quite static and wasn't quite voices. It was the broken, desperate sound of a communication system fighting through interference. Cassandra held the phone away from her ear and pressed a button. The sound expanded, now coming through the phone's speaker, filling the lobby. "Repeat, this is static. Experiencing severe, more static. Request immediate." The assistant, Andrew, moved closer. "Is that them?" "Quiet," Cassandra snapped. The noise continued, waves of interference punctuated by fragments of words that dissolved before they could form meaning. Ethan found himself stopping, his hand still on the cleaning cart's handle, listening despite himself. There was something familiar about the rhythm of those broken transmissions. Altitude dropping, static. Cannot maintain, static. Engines. Then, cutting through everything else, a voice, young, male, and absolutely terrified. "This is November the 7th, 3 Tango. Whiskey declaring—" The interference swallowed the rest, but when it cleared again, the voice was shouting, "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday! We are—" The words vanished into a wall of static that made Cassandra wince. She looked at Andrew, her face pale. "That's them. That's our plane. Can you respond?" "I don't—" She pressed the phone closer to her mouth. "This is Cassandra Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Global Ventures, November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey, Do you read me? Nothing but static. She tried again, louder this time. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey, this is Whitmore. If you can hear me, we're working on getting you help. Can you confirm your position? The static continued, unchanging. Andrew checked his tablet. The signal's bouncing through multiple towers. They could be anywhere within a 100-mile radius. That's not good enough. It's all we have right now. The weather is... Another burst of sound from the phone cut him off. This time it was clearer, as if the plane had momentarily emerged from whatever electromagnetic hell was blocking the signal. November 7-3 Tango, Whiskey to any station. Static. Critical systems failure. Static. Request vectors to nearest. The voice dissolved again, but not before Ethan's entire body went rigid. That phrase, those words, he knew them. Using emergency frequency, the voice continued through the interference. If anyone can hear this, we are declaring pan pan, pan pan, pan pan. Ethan's hand tightened on the cart handle. His breathing had changed without him realizing it. The cleaning cart, the lobby, the rain against the windows, all of it faded into background noise as his mind locked onto those transmissions. Pan pan, the international urgency signal, one level below Mayday. It meant the aircraft was in serious trouble, but not yet facing immediate catastrophic failure. But it also meant things were deteriorating fast. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey, requesting priority handling. Static. Partial electrical failure. Static. Unable to maintain assigned altitude. Cassandra was speaking rapidly to someone else now, probably another person on a different phone. Yes, emergency services. We need mountain rescue on standby. Helicopters if the weather clears. And I need you to contact... The transmission from the plane came back, stronger this time. Attempting to establish VOR navigation, but static. Primary instruments compromised. Static. Requesting QDM to nearest airfield. Ethan's head lifted. QDM. The magnetic bearing to a station. A specific aviation term used in emergency navigation when normal systems failed. It was old protocol. The kind of thing modern pilots learned but rarely used because GPS and advanced avionics had made it nearly obsolete. But in a storm like this, with electrical systems failing and modern equipment compromised, a skilled pilot would revert to basics, to the fundamentals drilled into them during training, to the protocols that had saved lives long before computers took over cockpits. Ethan's lips moved silently, forming words he hadn't spoken in years. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey to any station, we have 12 souls on board. The young pilot's voice cracked slightly. Fuel estimated for 90 minutes. Static. Requesting immediate assistance, Cassandra was still trying to communicate, her voice steady but strained. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey, this is Whitmore. Help is coming. Stay on this frequency. No response except the hiss of interference. Andrew looked up from his tablet. Search and rescue is mobilizing, but they can't launch until the weather... I know, Cassandra cut him off. What about air traffic control? They're tracking the emergency transponder, but the signal keeps cutting out. Best estimate puts them somewhere over the Cascade Range, but the mountains are interfering with... The phone speaker erupted with another burst of transmission. Experiencing severe turbulence. Static. Attempting to climb, but... Static. Need a heading. Any heading. We're flying blind here. The desperation in the pilot's voice was unmistakable now. This wasn't just an emergency. This was a crew running out of options, surrounded by mountains they couldn't see, fighting weather that was trying to kill them. Ethan felt something inside him shift. It was like a door he'd locked years ago, suddenly rattling in its frame, the old hinges protesting. He'd promised himself he'd never open that door again. He'd built his entire life around keeping it shut. But that voice on the speaker, young, scared, begging for help that might not come, was pulling at something buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it didn't exist anymore. Request emergency vectors, the pilot called out. We need a QDM. We need anything. Cassandra tried again. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey, can you give us your altitude? Static. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey, what is your fuel state? Static.
November 7-3. Tango. Whiskey.
Can't maintain course, the pilot's voice broke through, ragged with stress. Artificial horizon is gone. We're fighting the controls. Static. If anyone can hear this, we're declaring emergency. We need... The transmission cut off completely. Cassandra stared at her phone. Hello? Hello? Nothing. She looked at Andrew, her composure finally cracking. Did we lose them? The frequency's still active, but... The speaker crackled again. This time it wasn't the young pilot. It was an older voice, calmer but with an edge of barely controlled fear underneath. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey to any station, this is the captain. We have lost primary navigation. We have lost primary attitude indicators. We are currently in IMC, Instrument Meteorological Conditions, meaning they couldn't see anything outside the aircraft. And we need immediate guidance. We are squawking 7700, the International Emergency Code. If anyone can hear this transmission, we are requesting vectors out of the mountains. The captain paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. We have passengers. We have crew. We need help. The lobby was completely silent except for the static from the phone. Cassandra's hand shook slightly as she held the device. Andrew stood frozen, tablet forgotten. Even the security guard near the front desk had stopped his rounds, listening to the invisible drama playing out somewhere in the storm-ravaged mountains. And Ethan Walker, janitor, invisible member of the night shift, felt the locked door in his mind finally break open. He didn't remember making the decision to move. One moment he was standing by his cleaning cart, and the next he was walking toward Cassandra Whitmore, his footsteps echoing across the marble floor. She didn't notice him at first. She was too focused on the phone, trying desperately to re-establish contact with the aircraft. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey, this is Whitmore. Please respond. We have your emergency squawk. We're coordinating rescue. Ethan stopped a few feet away. His heart was hammering. His damaged shoulder ached, the way it always did when stress made him tense. Every instinct he'd developed over the last 5 years screamed at him to turn around, to go back to his cart, to remain invisible. But that voice on the speaker, the young pilot, the captain, the 12 people flying blind through a nightmare, wouldn't let him. "Ma'am," he said quietly. Cassandra didn't respond. She was listening to the static, waiting for the plane to come back. "Ma'am?" Ethan tried again, slightly louder. This time she heard him. She turned, and for a brief moment her expression was one of pure confusion, as if she couldn't quite process why the janitor was standing there, trying to get her attention in the middle of a crisis. "Not now," she said, not unkindly, but with absolute dismissal. I can help," Ethan said. Cassandra blinked. "What?" "With the plane. I can help." Andrew stepped forward, his face a mixture of annoyance and disbelief. "Sir, this is a private emergency. We need you to..." The phone speaker erupted again. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey declaring Mayday. The young pilot was back, and now he was genuinely panicking. We're in a spin! We can't..." "Pull back on the yoke," someone else screamed in the background. "Cut the power to..." Static swallowed the rest. Cassandra's face went white. "They're spinning! Oh my God, they're spinning!" Ethan didn't hesitate. He reached out and gently but firmly took the phone from her hand. She was too shocked to resist. He brought the phone to his mouth, and when he spoke, his voice was completely different from the quiet, deferential tone he used as a janitor. It was clear, authoritative, precise. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey, this is Walker. He used his last name without thinking, the way he always had. Confirm you are in an uncontrolled spin. The static continued. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey, acknowledge. Are you in a spin or spiral? For 3 seconds, there was nothing. Then, cutting through the interference, "We're spiraling." The pilot's voice was ragged. "Altimeter unwinding." "Copy your spiral," Ethan said, his tone calm and steady. "Listen carefully. Reduce power to idle. Level your wings using partial panel. Do not try to climb. Do you copy?" "Can't see the horizon." "You don't need the horizon. Use your standby instruments. Focus on your turn coordinator. Level the wings first. Everything else comes second." There was a pause. The static seemed to hold its breath. Leveling wings, the pilot said. Reducing power. Good, Ethan replied. Now gently, and I mean gently, ease back on the yoke. Don't jerk it. Don't overcorrect small movements. Talk to me when you're stable. Cassandra and Andrew stared at Ethan like he'd just performed a magic trick. The seconds stretched out. The static hissed. The rain hammered the windows. Then, wings level. The pilot's voice was still shaking, but no longer panicking. We're climbing. Copy your climb, Ethan said. What's your altitude? 8,200. And you're heading? 270? Ethan closed his eyes briefly, visualizing the terrain, the Cascade Range, mountains that reached over 10,000 feet, valleys that could trap an aircraft, passes that became death traps in bad weather. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey. You need to turn to heading 015. That will take you toward lower terrain. Can you execute that turn? Turning to 015, smooth and gentle, Ethan reminded him. Don't bank too steep. The storm wants you to overcorrect. Rolling out on 015. Good. Now tell me about your navigation systems. What do you have working? Primary GPS is down, the pilot reported. Backup GPS is intermittent. Static. The receiver is functional, but we're not picking up any stations. Ethan processed this. They were too deep in the mountains to receive VOR signals. GPS was unreliable in the storm. They were essentially navigating blind except for basic instruments. What about your radio compass? He asked. Do you have an ADF? Automatic direction finder. Old technology, mostly phased out in modern aircraft, but some corporate jets still carried them. Checking. A pause. Yes, we have ADF. Good. Stand by. Ethan lowered the phone slightly and looked at Cassandra. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, shock, confusion, and something else. I need to know where they are, he said quietly. Exact position if possible. She found her voice. How are you? Who are you? Ma'am, those people don't have time for explanations. Do you have their position or not? Andrew recovered first, checking his tablet with trembling hands. Last confirmed coordinates were 47.4 north, 121.8 west, but that was almost an hour ago. Ethan nodded slowly, his mind calculating. That's near Snoqualmie Pass. If they've been heading west, he raised the phone again. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey, I'm going to give you a frequency. I need you to tune your ADF to 365 kilohertz. Can you do that? 365 kilohertz, the pilot repeated. Tuning now. Ethan waited, counting seconds in his head. The frequency he'd given them was for a non-directional beacon near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. If the plane was where he thought it was, and if the ADF was working properly, the needle would point towards safety. We have a bearing, the pilot said, surprise evident in his voice. Needle is pointing 030. Perfect, Ethan replied. That bearing will take you to flat ground and out of the mountains. Turn to heading 030 and follow that needle. Keep your altitude above 9,000 feet until I tell you otherwise. Turning to 030, Cassandra leaned close to Ethan, her voice barely a whisper. How do you know this? How do you know any of this? He didn't answer. He was too focused on the phone, on the static, on the invisible aircraft fighting through the storm somewhere in the darkness. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey, what's your fuel state? Estimated 70 minutes remaining? 70 minutes. Enough time to get clear of the mountains and find an airport, but not enough for mistakes. Copy 70 minutes, Ethan said. You're doing great. Stay on heading 030 and maintain 9,000. The terrain drops off in about 15 miles. Once you're clear, we'll vector you to SeaTac or the nearest available field. Understood. The pilot's voice was steadier now, the panic burned away by focus and procedure. Maintaining 030 at 9,000. Ethan felt something in his chest loosen slightly. They weren't safe yet, not even close, but they had a direction, they had a plan, they had a chance. He became aware that the entire lobby had gone silent. The security guard had moved closer. Two more people, cleaning staff from the upper floors, had appeared near the elevators, drawn by the drama. And Cassandra Whitmore, CEO of a billion-dollar company, was staring at her janitor like she'd never seen him before. Because she hadn't, not really. November 7-3 Tango, whiskey, Ethan said into the phone. I need you to check in every 2 minutes. Let me know your altitude, heading, and fuel. Can you do that? Copy. Check-ins every 2 minutes. And listen to me carefully, Ethan added, his voice firm but not unkind. You're going to make it out of this. You did everything right. You kept the aircraft flying when it wanted to fall, and now you're heading to safety. Just stay focused. Stay calm. Talk to me every 2 minutes. Thank you. The pilot's voice cracked slightly. Thank you so much. Ethan lowered the phone and looked at Cassandra. Her face was pale, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. They should be okay, he said quietly. As long as the weather doesn't get worse and they can hold that heading, they'll clear the mountains in about 12 to 15 minutes. Then it's just a matter of getting them to an airport. Cassandra opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Who are you? She finally managed to ask. Before Ethan could answer, the phone spoke again. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey, 2-minute check-in, the pilot reported. Maintaining 030 at 9,000, fuel estimated 68 minutes. Copy all, Ethan responded. You're doing perfect. Stay with me. He handed the phone back to Cassandra, who took it numbly. I should get back to work, Ethan said, already turning toward his abandoned cleaning cart. Wait. Cassandra reached out, stopping just short of grabbing his arm. You need to… They're not out of danger yet, Ethan interrupted gently. You need to coordinate with air traffic control, get emergency services positioned at whatever airport they're heading to, and make sure someone qualified takes over talking them down. I gave them a direction and a way out, but they need real help now, professional help. You are professional help, Andrew blurted out. I don't know who you are or how you know all that, but you just saved those people. Ethan shook his head. Not yet. They still have to land. He walked back to his cart, every step feeling like he was moving through water. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline and old memories flooding through him in equal measure. He gripped the cart handle to steady himself. Behind him, he could hear Cassandra speaking rapidly to someone on the phone, a new person, probably actual aviation professionals who could take over from here. That was good. That was right. He'd done what he could. Now he needed to disappear again, to return to being invisible, to close that door he'd opened. But as he started to push the cart toward the elevators, he heard footsteps behind him, fast footsteps. Stop! Cassandra's voice cut through the lobby. Just stop! Ethan stopped. She walked around to face him, and he could see that her hands were shaking too. I need answers, she said, her voice low and intense. I need to know how a janitor, no offense, none taken, how a janitor knows emergency aviation procedures better than most pilots. I need to know how you knew that frequency, how you knew those commands, how you talked a plane out of a spin like you've done it 1,000 times before. Ethan met her eyes. They were sharp, intelligent, and absolutely relentless. This was a woman who built empires. She didn't let mysteries go unsolved. It's not important, he said, like hell it's not important. The profanity seemed to surprise her as much as him. She took a breath, visibly controlling herself. Those are my people on that plane, my employees, my responsibility, and you just saved them using knowledge that janitors don't have. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and I need you to tell me the truth. She stepped closer. Who are you? The phone in her hand crackled. November 7-3, Tango. Whiskey, 4-minute check-in, maintaining 030 at 9,000, fuel estimated 66 minutes. Neither of them moved to answer. Ethan could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him. The security guard, the cleaning staff, Andrew with his tablet, all of them waiting for an answer to a question he'd spent 5 years making sure nobody would ever think to ask. The rain hammered against the windows. The static hissed from the phone. And Ethan Walker, who'd been invisible for so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen, opened his mouth and began to tell the truth. My name is Ethan Walker, he said slowly, and 7 years ago I was a pilot. The words hung in the air like smoke. Cassandra's eyes widened. A pilot? Not just any pilot, Ethan continued, the words coming easier now, like a dam breaking. I flew rescue operations, mountain rescue specifically. I spent 6 years flying into terrain that commercial pilots wouldn't touch, pulling people off mountains, out of valleys, away from disasters. I know those emergency procedures because I lived them. I know that frequency because I've used it dozens of times. I know how to talk someone through a spin because I've been in spins myself. Then what are you doing? Cassandra gestured at his uniform, at the cleaning cart, at the entire impossible situation. Why are you here? Ethan's expression darkened. His right shoulder, the one that sat too high, that ached in bad weather and during stress, throbbed in response to the memory. Because 7 years ago, he said quietly, I flew into a storm that was worse than it was supposed to be. I was trying to rescue climbers off Mount Rainier during a weather window that closed faster than anyone predicted. And when the turbulence hit, when the winds caught us wrong, when everything that could go wrong did go wrong, he paused. I crashed. The lobby was absolutely silent. Not completely, Ethan continued. I managed an emergency landing on a ridge that shouldn't have held an aircraft that size. I got everyone out alive, the climbers, my co-pilot, my crew. But the landing destroyed my shoulder and fractured my spine in 3 places. The doctors said I was lucky to walk. The FAA said I'd never fly again. He looked down at the cleaning cart, at the spray bottles and the mop, at the physical manifestation of how far he'd fallen. They were right, he said. I haven't touched a cockpit in 7 years. Cassandra stared at him, and he could see her mind working, processing, recalculating everything she thought she knew about the man who cleaned her building's floors. The phone crackled again. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey, 6-minute check-in. This time Cassandra answered. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey, this is Whitmore. Continue on your heading. We have you on radar now, and emergency services are standing by. She listened for a moment, then added, You're going to be fine. Just stay calm. She lowered the phone and looked at Ethan. They're going to make it, she said. Thanks to you. Ethan shook his head. Thanks to good training and a lot of luck. I just pointed them in the right direction. You did more than that. Ma'am, with respect, I need to finish my shift. There are still 3 floors. Forget the floors, Cassandra interrupted. I want to know. She stopped herself, seemed to think better of whatever she was about to say. No, not here. Not like this. She turned to Andrew. Cancel my morning meetings. All of them? All of them. She looked back at Ethan. You work until 6 a.m.? Yes, ma'am. Then at 6 a.m., you and I are going to have a conversation, a real conversation, because I think, she paused, choosing her words carefully. I think there's more to your story than a crash 7 years ago, and I think you and I need to talk about what happens next. There is no what happens next, Ethan said. I'm a janitor. That's my life now. Is it? Cassandra asked, and there was something in her voice that made Ethan's chest tighten. Because 15 minutes ago, you talked a plane through an emergency like a professional aviator. That doesn't sound like someone who's just a janitor. Before Ethan could respond, the phone erupted with voices. November 7-3 Tango, Whiskey, we're clear of the mountains. The pilot sounded like he might cry from relief. We can see lights ahead. Cassandra smiled, the first genuine smile Ethan had seen from her all night. November 7-3 Tango. Whiskey. That's Seattle. You made it. Follow the vectors from approach control, and they'll bring you home. Understood. The pilot's voice was thick with emotion. And please, whoever that was who helped us, please tell him thank you. Tell him he saved our lives. Cassandra looked at Ethan. I'll tell him, she said. The transmission continued, now being handled by professional air traffic controllers who would guide the plane safely to the ground. The crisis was over. 12 people who might have died in the mountains would land safely, shake hands with emergency crews, call their families, and eventually go home. And Ethan Walker, who had been invisible for 5 years, found himself standing in the middle of a marble lobby, being stared at by a billionaire CEO who looked at him like he was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. 6 a.m., Cassandra said again. My office, we're going to talk. Ma'am, I really don't think. 6 a.m., she repeated, and this time it wasn't a request. She walked away, still holding her phone, already speaking to someone else about landing protocols and emergency procedures, and a dozen other things that Ethan could hear but wasn't really listening to. Andrew lingered for a moment, looking at Ethan with something between awe and confusion. He trailed off. That was incredible. Then he hurried after Cassandra, leaving Ethan alone with his cart, the security guard, and the two cleaning staff members who were whispering to each other near the elevators. Ethan stood there for a long moment, listening to the rain, listening to the static that still hissed faintly from somewhere, listening to the echo of words he'd spoken in a voice he'd buried years ago. His hands were still shaking, his shoulders still ached, and the locked door in his mind, the one he'd kept shut for 7 years, the one that held memories of the sky and the wind and the feeling of flying, was wide open now, and he had no idea how to close it again. He pushed his cart toward the elevators, riding up to the 3rd floor in silence, and tried to focus on the work he still had to do. But every time he started to wipe down a desk or empty a trash can, he would hear that pilot's voice in his head. "Thank you. You saved our lives." And he would remember what it felt like to be Captain Ethan Walker, to be someone who mattered, to be someone other than invisible. The 3rd floor smelled like leather furniture and expensive coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Ethan pushed his cart through the executive suite, moving on autopilot while his mind replayed the last hour in an endless loop. The cleaning routine was so ingrained in his muscle memory that his hands worked without conscious thought. Spray bottle, microfiber cloth, wipe in circular motions, move to the next surface. But his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. They were in a cockpit fighting through a storm. They were in that moment when the young pilot's voice had cracked with terror, when the captain had spoken with the careful control of someone trying not to panic, when Ethan had reached for knowledge he'd sworn he'd never use again. His right shoulder throbbed with each movement, a dull ache that radiated down his arm and into his spine. 7 years and countless physical therapy sessions later, it still hurt. The doctors had told him the pain would fade with time. They'd been wrong about that too. He finished the executive suite and moved to the conference rooms, each one a monument to corporate excess with floor-to-ceiling windows, tables that could seat 20, and screens for video conferences with offices around the world. During the day, these rooms hosted meetings where decisions worth millions of dollars were made in the time it took Ethan to clean them. Now they were empty and silent. Ethan was wiping down the last conference table when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He almost ignored it. At 1:47 a.m., there was only one person who would be texting him, and he already knew what she'd be asking, but he checked it anyway. The message was from his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, a 72-year-old retired teacher who lived in the apartment next to his and watched Sophie on the nights Ethan worked. "Sophie woke up, bad dream, got her back to sleep. She asked about you. Everything okay?" Ethan felt his chest tighten. Sophie had nightmares sometimes, always the same one, her mother in the hospital, the monitors beeping, the moment when the beeping stopped. It had been 3 years since Emily died, but grief didn't follow a schedule. Some nights Sophie slept peacefully, other nights she woke up crying for a mother who would never answer. He typed back quickly. "Everything's fine. Tell her I'll be home at 6:30. Thank you, Mrs. Chen." The response came immediately. "No problem. She's sleeping now. See you in the morning." Ethan put the phone away and stood there in the empty conference room, looking out at the city lights blurred by rain. Somewhere out there, Sophie was asleep in their small 2-bedroom apartment, surrounded by the stuffed animals she was getting too old for but refused to part with. Her homework spread across the kitchen table because she always waited until the last minute. Her shoes kicked off by the door in exactly the spot where Ethan would trip over them when he got home. She was 9 years old. She loved drawing and hated math. She wanted a dog, but their apartment didn't allow pets. She asked him at least once a week when they could go flying together because she'd seen pictures of him in uniform from before the crash, before Emily got sick, before everything fell apart. And every time she asked, Ethan told her the same thing. "Someday, sweetheart. Someday." It was a lie, and they both knew it. He finished the 4th floor by 3:15 a.m. and rode the elevator down to the lobby for his break. The security guard, whose name was Marcus, was sitting at the reception desk with a thermos of coffee and a paperback novel that looked like it had been read a dozen times. "Hey," Marcus said when Ethan approached. That was something else earlier. Ethan poured himself coffee from his own thermos. Black, no sugar, strong enough to strip paint. Just helped out where I could. Man, that was more than helping out. You talked a plane through an emergency like you were air traffic control or something. Marcus leaned forward, curiosity evident in his eyes. You really used to be a pilot? Long time ago. How long? 7 years. Marcus whistled low. And you went from that to... He gestured at Ethan's uniform. Life happens, Ethan said simply, taking a sip of coffee. It was bitter and perfect. Yeah, but... Marcus stopped himself. Sorry, not my business. It's fine. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the rain against the windows and the distant hum of the building's HVAC system. Ethan checked his watch. 3 hours and 15 minutes until his shift ended. 3 hours and 15 minutes until he was supposed to go to Cassandra Whitmore's office and have a conversation he absolutely did not want to have. You think she's serious? Marcus asked, as if reading his thoughts. About talking to you? She seems serious. Whitmore doesn't mess around. When she says she wants something, she gets it. Marcus paused. You know, she built this whole company from basically nothing. Her dad had some real estate holdings that were going under, and she took over when she was like 25. Everyone said she'd fail. 5 years later, she's on the cover of magazines, and this building's got her name on it. Ethan didn't respond. He'd heard the Cassandra Whitmore story before. Everyone who worked in this building had. It was part of the corporate mythology, the bootstrap narrative that executives love to tell themselves. Young woman takes failing company, works harder than everyone else, makes ruthless decisions, becomes successful beyond measure. What they never talked about was the cost. The relationship sacrificed, the hours lost, the parts of yourself you had to cut away to become that successful. Ethan knew about cost. I should get back to work, he said, finishing his coffee. Yeah. Hey, listen. Marcus hesitated. What you did tonight, that was good, really good. Those people are alive because of you. Ethan nodded and walked away before Marcus could say anything else. The 5th floor was quieter than the others, mostly storage and file rooms that didn't need as much attention. Ethan worked mechanically, his thoughts drifting despite his best efforts to stay focused. He kept thinking about that moment in the lobby, when he'd taken the phone from Cassandra's hand, when he'd heard himself speak in a voice that belonged to a different person, a different life. Captain Walker. That's who he'd been once. Captain Ethan Walker, known for his steady hands and calm voice, the pilot other pilots called when things got complicated, when the weather was bad, when someone needed to be pulled off a mountain in conditions that should have grounded every aircraft in the state. He'd been good at it. Better than good. Flying had been the one thing in his life that made complete sense, where all the chaos of the world reduced down to simple physics and careful decisions. In a cockpit, Ethan had never felt lost. He'd always known exactly who he was and what he was supposed to do. Then came that day on Mount Rainier, Ethan's hand stilled on the window he was cleaning, his reflection staring back at him from the rain-streaked glass. He could still remember every detail of that flight, the way the clouds had looked too close, the wind shear that hit without warning, the sickening moment when the aircraft stopped responding the way it should, the screaming of the co-pilot, the desperate radio calls, and then the impact. The sound of metal tearing, the world spinning, pain that erased everything else. And then, somehow, silence. He'd kept everyone alive, the climbers, his crew, himself. But the cost had been his career, his identity, the thing that defined him more than anything else. The FAA medical examiner had been sympathetic but firm. The injuries to Ethan's shoulder and spine, while not completely debilitating, were severe enough that he could no longer meet the physical requirements for a commercial pilot's license. He could appeal, could go through months of additional examinations and evaluations, could fight the decision. But Ethan had been in too much pain, physically and emotionally, to fight. Emily had just been diagnosed. Sophie needed him. And the truth was, part of him didn't want to fly anymore. Part of him was terrified of getting back in a cockpit, of facing that moment when everything could go wrong again. So he'd let it go. Let Captain Walker die quietly, while Ethan Walker figured out how to survive as something else. The janitor job had come through a friend of a friend who knew someone in building management. It paid enough to cover rent and Sophie's needs. The night shift meant he could be home during the day for his daughter. It wasn't glamorous, wasn't meaningful, wasn't anything close to what he'd imagined his life would be, but it was stable, safe, invisible. Until tonight. Ethan finished the 5th floor at 4:43 a.m. and started on the 6th. This floor housed Whitmore Global Ventures' main offices, including Cassandra's personal suite at the far end. He'd cleaned these offices hundreds of times, moving through them like a ghost while the remnants of the workday lay scattered across desks, contracts, presentations, notes from meetings, the detritus of running an empire. He was cleaning the hallway outside Cassandra's office when he heard voices. Female voices, coming from behind the closed door. Ethan paused, his hand on the cleaning cart. He shouldn't eavesdrop. It was unprofessional, potentially job-threatening, and none of his business. But he also couldn't help hearing. The door wasn't quite closed all the way, and sound carried in the empty building. "Don't understand why you're so interested in him." That was a voice Ethan didn't recognize, sharp and skeptical. "He's a janitor, Cassandra. Yes, he helped with the emergency, but that doesn't mean—" "It means he has skills we need," Cassandra interrupted. "Did you see the way he handled that situation? He didn't panic. He didn't hesitate. He knew exactly what to do. Because he used to be a pilot. Past tense. There's probably a reason he's not flying anymore. I intend to find out what that reason is." A pause. Then the other voice again, more careful this time. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Cassandra said slowly, "that we have an aviation division that's been struggling to find qualified instructors for our simulator program. I'm thinking that we just watched a man talk a plane through an emergency better than most air traffic controllers could. And I'm thinking that maybe there's an opportunity here." "You want to offer him a job?" "I want to have a conversation, see if he's interested, see if he's capable." "Based on one emergency?" "Cassandra, we don't know anything about this guy. We don't know why he stopped flying. We don't know if he's reliable. We don't know—" "Then we'll find out," Cassandra said firmly. "That's what the conversation is for, Rachel." Rachel, probably Rachel Torres, Cassandra's chief of staff, a woman Ethan had seen exactly 3 times in 5 years and who had looked through him every single time, sighed audibly. "You're the boss," she said, "but be careful. People who end up working as janitors when they used to have careers like that, usually there's a story, and usually it's not a good one." "Everyone has a story," Cassandra replied quietly. "Some of them are worth listening to." Footsteps approached the door. Ethan quickly moved his cart down the hallway, making himself busy with a water fountain, his back to Cassandra's office. He heard the door open, heard the 2 women step out, heard their footsteps fade toward the elevators. He waited until they were gone before letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They wanted to offer him a job. A real job, not cleaning floors. Something in aviation, something that would pull him back toward the life he'd lost. The thought should have excited him, should have filled him with hope, with possibility, with the chance to reclaim part of his old identity. Instead, it terrified him, because Ethan knew the truth that Cassandra didn't, the story that Rachel was right to be suspicious of. He wasn't just a pilot who'd gotten injured. He was a pilot who'd failed, who'd made mistakes, who'd crashed. Yes, everyone survived. Yes, he'd done his best in impossible circumstances, but he'd still crashed, still lost control, still ended up broken on a mountain ridge, unable to do the one thing that had defined his entire adult life. What if it happened again? What if he got back into aviation, even just simulator training, and discovered that the skills he'd once had were gone? What if the confidence that had carried him through 1,000 flights had died along with his career? What if Captain Walker was really, truly dead, and all that was left was a janitor with a limp and a daughter who needed him to be stable? Ethan finished the 6th floor in silence, his thoughts churning. By the time he reached the 7th and final floor, the sky outside was beginning to lighten, the rain finally tapering off to a drizzle. Dawn was coming. His shift was almost over. And then he'd have to face Cassandra Whitmore and decide whether to risk everything he'd built in the last 7 years for a chance at something more. He was emptying trash cans in the 7th floor break room when his phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Sophie, sent from the tablet Mrs. Chen letter U's. "Dad, can we have pancakes when you get home?" Ethan smiled despite everything. Sophie asked for pancakes at least 3 mornings a week. He always said yes, Sure, sweetheart. Chocolate chip? Yes! Go back to sleep. I'll be home soon. Okay, love you, Dad. Love you too, Sophie. He put the phone away and stood there in the break room, surrounded by coffee makers and refrigerators and motivational posters that said things like, "Teamwork makes the dream work," and "Innovation starts here." The irony wasn't lost on him. At 5:47 a.m., Ethan finished his final task, wiping down the bathroom mirrors on the 7th floor, and returned his cart to the maintenance closet on the 1st floor. He changed out of his work boots into the worn sneakers he wore for the walk home, signed out on the timesheet, and stood in the lobby trying to decide what to do. Cassandra had said 6 a.m. It was now 5:51. He could leave, just walk out the front door, go home to Sophie, make pancakes, and pretend tonight had never happened. Cassandra would probably try to contact him later, but he could ignore it. He could quit if he had to, find another janitorial job, stay invisible. Or he could go upstairs to her office and see what she wanted. The elevator doors opened. Cassandra Whitmore stepped out, looking exactly as polished and professional as she had 7 hours earlier, as if she hadn't just spent the entire night dealing with an aviation emergency. She saw Ethan immediately. "You're still here," she said, and there was something like relief in her voice. "I wasn't sure you would be." "I thought about leaving," Ethan admitted. "But you didn't." "Not yet." Cassandra smiled slightly. "Come on, my office. We need to talk." She turned and walked toward the elevator without waiting to see if he'd follow. Ethan watched her go, his heart hammering in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run. But he thought about that pilot's voice, young and terrified, thanking him for saving lives. He thought about Sophie asking when they could go flying. He thought about the locked door in his mind that had been forced open and refused to close. And he followed Cassandra into the elevator. They rode up in silence. Cassandra stood with her hands clasped in front of her, her expression unreadable. Ethan kept his eyes on the floor numbers ticking upward, each one feeling like a step towards something he wasn't sure he was ready for. The elevator opened on the 6th floor. Cassandra led him down the hallway he'd cleaned less than an hour ago, past offices that were starting to fill with early arriving employees who glanced at Ethan with obvious confusion. A janitor, walking with the CEO at 6 in the morning. It would be the talk of the office by lunch. Cassandra's office was exactly what Ethan expected. Massive windows overlooking the city, furniture that cost more than his annual salary, shelves lined with awards and photographs of Cassandra with various politicians and celebrities and business leaders. Her desk was immaculate except for a single laptop and a coffee cup that looked like it had been refilled multiple times. She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "Sit." Ethan sat. Cassandra remained standing, looking out the window at the rain-soaked city as the first rays of sunrise broke through the clouds. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than it had been in the lobby. "That plane landed safely," she said. "All 12 people walked away without a scratch. The pilots are calling it a miracle." She turned to look at Ethan. "But we both know it wasn't a miracle. It was you." "I just gave them a heading," Ethan said. You gave them more than that. You gave them calm when they were panicking. You gave them confidence when they were terrified. You gave them a chance when they thought they were going to die." Cassandra moved to her desk, leaning against it. "The captain called me an hour ago. Do you know what he said?" Ethan shook his head. "He said whoever talked him through that emergency knew more about flying than anyone he'd ever met. He said it was like having a guardian angel on the radio." She paused. "He wants to know who you are." "I'm nobody." "That's a lie. And we both know it." Cassandra sat down in her chair, her eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "So let's start with the truth. You said you were a rescue pilot. Where? For whom?" Ethan hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding it. She'd find out anyway. "Northwest Mountain Rescue. I flew for them for 6 years, based out of Seattle, Tacoma. We did emergency evacuation, search and rescue, medical transport in terrain that regular helicopters couldn't handle. And you were good at it." "I was alive at it. That counted for something." Cassandra pulled her laptop closer and typed something. "Ethan Walker, Northwest Mountain Rescue." She read for a moment, her expression changing subtly. "You have 47 successful rescue operations on record. 3 of them were during weather conditions officially classified as unsurvivable. You received commendations from the National Park Service, the Coast Guard, And the governor's office. She looked up. This isn't the resume of someone who's nobody. That was 7 years ago. What happened 7 years ago? Ethan's jaw tightened. I crashed. I need more than that. There's not much more to tell. Bad weather, bad decisions, bad luck. I managed to land the aircraft without killing anyone, but I destroyed my shoulder and my spine in the process. The FAA pulled my medical certificate. End of career. Cassandra studied him for a long moment. That's the official story. What's the real one? That is the real one. Then why are you working as a janitor? With your experience, you could have transitioned to a dozen different aviation careers. Training, safety consulting, aircraft design, accident investigation, any of those would pay better and use your skills. I have a daughter, Ethan said quietly. She needs me. The janitor job lets me work nights and be home during the day. That's what matters. A daughter. Cassandra's expression softened slightly. How old? 9. And her mother? Died 3 years ago. The office fell silent. Cassandra looked down at her desk, then back at Ethan, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely uncertain. I'm sorry, she said finally. I'm sorry. Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Cassandra took a breath and seemed to reset herself, returning to the professional demeanor that probably came more naturally to her than sympathy. Here's what I know, she said. I have an aviation division that needs experienced instructors for our flight simulator program. We train young pilots, corporate crews, emergency response teams. The simulators can replicate almost any scenario: weather, equipment failure, emergencies. She paused. We need someone who's been through those scenarios for real. Someone who can teach from experience, not just theory. Ethan felt his heart rate increase. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you an opportunity to find out if you want a job. Come to our training facility. Try the simulator. See if you remember how. She leaned forward. If you're good, and I think you will be, we'll talk about a position, full-time, day shift, salary that's significantly better than what you're making now. You'd be able to spend evenings with your daughter instead of cleaning floors all night. It was everything Ethan hadn't let himself hope for. A way back to aviation, better pay, normal hours. A chance to be Captain Walker again, even if only in a simulator. And if I'm not good? He asked. Cassandra smiled slightly. Then you go back to your current job and we pretend this conversation never happened. No risk, no pressure, just try. Ethan looked out the window at the city bathed in morning light, the rain finally stopping, the clouds breaking apart to reveal blue sky underneath. He thought about Sophie, about pancakes and homework and bedtime stories. He thought about the locked door that refused to stay closed. He thought about that pilot's voice thanking him for saving lives. When? He heard himself ask. Tomorrow night, after your shift ends, I'll have a car waiting to take you to the facility. Cassandra stood, extending her hand. What do you say, Captain Walker? Ethan looked at her hand for a long moment. Then he stood and shook it. I'll be there, he said. And just like that, the door he'd been trying to keep closed swung wide open. The apartment smelled like burning pancakes when Ethan walked through the door at 6:47 a.m. He could hear Sophie's laughter from the kitchen, high and bright, mixing with Mrs. Chen's patient instructions about watching the heat on the stove. Dad's home! Sophie shouted, and then she was running toward him, still in her pajamas, the ones with the stars and moons that were getting too small, but she refused to give up. She crashed into him with the force of a small hurricane, wrapping her arms around his waist. Ethan caught her, his right shoulder protesting the sudden impact, but he didn't care. He hugged her back, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and the faint smell of smoke that clung to her clothes. Hey, sweetheart, he said, ruffling her dark hair. What happened to waiting for me to make pancakes? I wanted to surprise you, Sophie said, pulling back to look up at him with eyes that were exactly like her mother's, brown and wide and full of mischief. But Mrs. Chen says I need more practice. Much more practice, Mrs. Chen confirmed, appearing in the kitchen doorway with a spatula in hand and an expression of mock severity. Your daughter tried to flip a pancake and it ended up on the ceiling. Ethan looked at the ceiling. Sure enough, there was a pancake stuck to it, slowly losing its battle with gravity. "That's impressive," he said. "I know, right?" Sophie beamed, completely missing the sarcasm. "Mrs. Chen had to use a broom to get the first one down." "There were two?" "There were three," Mrs. Chen said, shaking her head but smiling. "The third one landed on the floor. The dog from 3B would have loved it." Ethan couldn't help but laugh. It felt good, the kind of good that came from being home with his daughter, surrounded by small disasters that didn't matter, far away from corporate lobbies and aviation emergencies and conversations about jobs he didn't know if he could handle. "Go wash up," Mrs. Chen told Sophie. "Your father and I need to talk." Sophie groaned but obeyed, padding off to the bathroom. The moment she was gone, Mrs. Chen's expression turned serious. "You look exhausted," she said bluntly. Mrs. Chen had never been one for diplomatic phrasing. "More than usual." "Long night." "I figured. Sophie said you texted around 2 in the morning. That's later than normal." She studied him with the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent 40 years teaching middle school and could spot a lie from across a classroom. "What happened?" Ethan hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding it. Mrs. Chen would find out eventually anyway. She had a way of extracting information that would make intelligence agencies jealous. "There was an emergency," he said. "A plane got into trouble during the storm. I helped talk them through it." Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose. "You helped talk them through it. You, the janitor." "I used to be a pilot." "I know what you used to be, Ethan. I'm asking what happened last night." So he told her. Not everything. He left out the parts about Cassandra's office and the job offer, but enough that she understood what had happened. When he finished, Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "That girl of yours," she said finally, "asks me at least once a week when you're going to fly again. I always tell her to ask you. Now I'm asking, are you going to fly again?" "I can't fly. You know that." "The FAA. I'm not talking about the FAA or medical certificates or any of that bureaucratic nonsense," Mrs. Chen interrupted. "I'm asking if you're going to let yourself be a pilot again, even if it's just in some other way, because that child in there deserves a father who's living, not just surviving." The words hit harder than Ethan expected. He looked toward the bathroom, where he could hear Sophie singing off-key while she brushed her teeth, and felt something twist in his chest. "It's complicated," he said quietly. "Everything worth doing is complicated." Mrs. Chen handed him the spatula. "Make your daughter some pancakes. And Ethan, whatever happened last night, whatever opportunity it created, don't run from it just because you're scared. Sophie's watching. She's always watching." She gathered her purse and sweater, gave him a quick pat on the arm that somehow conveyed both sympathy and a warning, and left. Ethan stood in the kitchen, spatula in hand, staring at the pancake on the ceiling. Then Sophie emerged from the bathroom, her face scrubbed clean and her hair pulled back in a lopsided ponytail she'd attempted herself. "Ready for pancakes?" she asked hopefully. "Ready for pancakes," Ethan confirmed. They cooked together, Sophie chattering constantly about school and her best friend Maya and the art project she was working on and whether they could go to the science museum this weekend. Ethan let her voice wash over him, responding at the right moments, flipping pancakes that actually landed in the pan instead of on the ceiling. When they finally sat down to eat, Sophie drowned her pancakes in syrup and looked at him with sudden seriousness. "Mrs. Chen said you had a long night," she said. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart." "You don't look fine. You look—" She scrunched up her face, searching for the word. "Worried." Ethan smiled despite himself. "I'm not worried, just tired. Mom used to say that when she was worried but didn't want me to know." Sophie took a bite of pancake, then added with the blunt honesty of a 9-year-old, "It didn't work then either." Ethan set down his fork. Emily had always said Sophie was too perceptive for her own good, that she noticed things other kids missed, that she could read emotions like some people read books. It was a gift and a curse, especially for a child who'd already lost her mother and spent too much time worrying about her father. "Okay," he said carefully. "I am a little worried, but not about anything bad. More like nervous about something that might be good." Sophie's eyes lit up. "What might be good?" "Someone offered me a chance to try something new, something related to flying." The reaction was immediate. Sophie straightened in her chair, her breakfast forgotten. "Flying? Like in a plane? Like you used to do? Not exactly like I used to do. More like teaching other people to fly. In a simulator. What's a simulator? It's like a video game, but for pilots. It looks and feels like flying a real plane, but it's safe. People use it to practice. Sophie's mind was clearly racing, connecting dots, building possibilities. So you'd be flying again? Sort of? Sort of? Maybe. I don't know yet. I have to try it first, see if I'm still good at it. You'll be good at it, Sophie said with absolute certainty. You were the best pilot ever. You told me so. I never said I was the best. You said you never crashed. That's basically the same thing. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He'd told Sophie a lot of stories about his flying days, carefully edited versions that left out the fear and the danger and the ending. He'd never mentioned the crash on Mount Rainier, never explained exactly why he'd stopped flying. She knew he'd been hurt, knew he couldn't do it anymore, but she didn't know the details, and he wasn't sure he could ever tell her. When do you try the simulator? Sophie asked, pulling him back to the present. Tomorrow night, after work. Can I come? No, sweetheart, it's not. Please? Sophie's eyes went wide in the expression she'd perfected over the years, the one that made Ethan's resolve crumble like wet sand. I want to see you fly, even if it's not real flying. Please, Dad. Sophie, I'll be super quiet. I won't touch anything. I'll just watch, please? Ethan looked at his daughter, at the hope written across her face, and felt something break inside him. She'd lost her mother. She'd watched her father work a job that made him invisible. She'd asked for so little over the years, and he'd been able to give her even less. Maybe this was something he could give her. A chance to see him as something other than a tired janitor who came home smelling like industrial cleaner. A chance to see Captain Walker, even if only for an hour. I'll ask, he said carefully. I can't promise anything, but I'll ask. Sophie launched herself out of her chair and hugged him so hard she nearly knocked him off his seat. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I said I'd ask. That doesn't mean you're the best dad ever. Ethan hugged her back and hoped he wasn't making a terrible mistake. The rest of the day passed in a blur of normal activities that felt surreal after the previous night. Ethan slept for a few hours while Sophie was at school, got up to make dinner, helped with homework that involved fractions and reading comprehension, and tried not to think about tomorrow night. He failed spectacularly. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw a cockpit, felt his hands on controls, heard the engine noise and the wind and the voice of his co-pilot calling out altitudes. The memories were so vivid they didn't feel like memories at all. They felt like premonitions, like warnings, like his subconscious trying to tell him this was a terrible idea. That night, he texted Cassandra from his phone while Sophie was getting ready for bed. It felt strange, having the CEO's personal number. Stranger still to be texting her like they were equals, instead of employer and employee separated by about 1,000,000 rungs on the corporate ladder. My daughter wants to come tomorrow night. Is that possible? The response came within 2 minutes. How old? 9. Bring her. The facility is secure and we have observation areas. She can watch. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen the simulator. Ethan stared at that last message, trying to decode its meaning. Was it a warning? A joke? A statement of fact? With Cassandra, it was impossible to tell. He put the phone away and went to tuck Sophie in. She was already under the covers, her stuffed elephant, a gift from Emily that had seen better days, clutched to her chest. Dad? She said as he turned off the light. Yeah? Are you scared? About tomorrow? Ethan sat on the edge of her bed, the mattress creaking under his weight. Through the window he could see the city lights, could hear the distant sound of traffic, could feel the weight of tomorrow pressing down on him like gravity. Yeah, he admitted. I'm scared. Why? Because I haven't done this in a long time. Because I don't know if I'm still good at it. Because... He trailed off, searching for words that would make sense to a 9-year-old. Because sometimes when you lose something important, it's scary to try to get it back. You're afraid it won't be the same. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that sounded far older than 9, Mom used to say that being scared means you're about to do something brave. Ethan felt tears prick at his eyes. Emily had said that, usually right before Sophie had to do something that terrified her. The first day of school, a doctor's appointment, learning to ride a bike. Being scared means you're about to do something brave. Your mom was a smart lady, he said quietly. I know. Sophie yawned. You're going to be great tomorrow, Dad. I just know it. How do you know? Because you're my dad, and my dad can do anything. Ethan kissed her forehead, told her he loved her, and left before she could see him cry. The next day crawled by with excruciating slowness. Ethan went through his routine, getting Sophie ready for school, doing laundry, grocery shopping, picking Sophie up, making dinner. But his mind was elsewhere. He kept checking the clock, watching the hours tick by, feeling his anxiety build with each passing minute. At 10:47 p.m., he arrived at Meridian Tower for his shift wearing his uniform and carrying a backpack with a change of clothes for after. Sophie was with Mrs. Chen, already asleep, with instructions to be woken up at 5:30 a.m. so they could meet the car Cassandra was sending. The shift was torture. Every floor took twice as long as usual because Ethan couldn't focus. He kept making mistakes, missing spots, using the wrong cleaning solution, forgetting which rooms he'd already done. Marcus noticed. You okay, man? The security guard asked during Ethan's break. You seem distracted. Big night tomorrow, Ethan said. The simulator thing? Yeah. Marcus studied him. You don't seem excited. I'm terrified. Why? Ethan thought about how to answer that. What if I'm not good anymore? What if everything I knew is gone? What if I get in that simulator and realize that Captain Walker is dead and all that's left is a janitor who used to fly? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You know what I think? I think you're not afraid you've lost it. I think you're afraid you haven't. Because if you're still good, that means you've been wasting the last 7 years doing this. He gestured at the cleaning cart. When you could have been doing that. The words hit like a physical blow. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, to defend himself, to explain all the reasons why he'd made the choices he'd made. But he couldn't, because Marcus was right. At 5:52 a.m., Ethan's shift ended. He changed in the bathroom, trading his uniform for jeans and a button-down shirt that he'd ironed the night before. His hand shook as he buttoned it. A black car was waiting outside the tower at 6:03 a.m., sleek and expensive, with a driver who nodded politely and opened the rear door without a word. Ethan gave him his address, and they drove through the early morning streets to his apartment. Mrs. Chen had Sophie ready and waiting. The girl was practically vibrating with excitement, dressed in her favorite outfit and clutching a backpack with snacks and a notebook. I'm bringing my drawing pad, she announced as she climbed into the car, so I can draw you in the cockpit. It's a simulator, not a real cockpit, Ethan reminded her. Close enough. Mrs. Chen leaned into the car before closing the door. Good luck, she told Ethan. Then quieter. Make that girl proud. The drive to the training facility took 40 minutes, heading north out of the city into an area where buildings gave way to industrial parks and private airfields. Sophie pressed her face against the window the entire time, asking questions about everything they passed. Is that where you used to fly? No, different airport. Are there going to be real planes there? I don't know. What if you crash the simulator? You can't really crash a simulator, that's the point. But what if you do? Then I start over. The training facility was larger than Ethan expected, a sprawling complex of buildings with a tall control tower and several hangars visible in the distance. The car pulled up to a modern glass and steel structure with Whitmore Aviation Training Center emblazoned across the entrance. Cassandra was waiting inside, along with a man in his 50s wearing a flight instructor's uniform. She smiled when she saw Sophie. You must be Sophie, she said, crouching down to the girl's level. I'm Cassandra. Your dad's going to do something very cool today. Sophie nodded seriously. I know, he's going to fly. He is. Cassandra stood and looked at Ethan. This is Captain James Morrison. He runs our simulator program. He'll be evaluating your performance. Morrison extended a hand. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in cockpits, with lines around his eyes and a firm handshake that spoke of confidence and experience. Captain Walker, he said, and Ethan flinched slightly at the title. Ms. Whitmore's told me about you. Quite a resume. That was a long time ago. We'll see. Morrison gestured down a hallway. The simulator's this way. We'll start with something simple, work our way up to more complex scenarios. Sound good? Sure, Ethan said, though his voice sounded far away even to himself. They walked down corridors lined with photographs of aircraft and historical aviation moments, past classrooms where young pilots studied weather patterns and navigation charts, past offices where instructors prepared lesson plans. Sophie held Ethan's hand, squeezing it occasionally, her excitement palpable. Finally, they reached a large room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a massive cylindrical structure that looked like something from a science fiction movie. The simulator sat on hydraulic legs, its exterior covered in sensors and mechanical components. A stairway led up to a door in its side. Full-motion simulator, Morrison explained. 6 degrees of freedom, 220-degree visual display, realistic flight controls and systems. It can replicate any aircraft type and any scenario you can imagine. Weather, mechanical failures, emergencies, everything. Ethan stared at it, his heart pounding. We'll start you in a light twin-engine aircraft, Morrison continued, similar to what you flew during your rescue operations. Basic flight maneuvers first. Then we'll introduce complications and see how you handle them. Where will I be? Sophie asked. Cassandra gestured to a room adjacent to the simulator bay. In the observation room. You'll be able to see everything through those windows, and we'll have the audio from the simulator piped in so you can hear your dad. Sophie looked at Ethan. Are you ready? No, he wanted to say, not even close, but instead he nodded. Ready as I'll ever be. Morrison led him up the stairs and into the simulator. The door closed behind them with a solid thunk that made Ethan's stomach drop. Inside, it was exactly like a real cockpit. 2 seats, instrument panels covered in gauges and switches and displays, windows that currently showed nothing but darkness, and the smell of electronics and leather. Take the left seat, Morrison said, settling into the right. Familiarize yourself with the controls. We're not in a hurry. Ethan lowered himself into the pilot's seat and felt 7 years of distance collapse in an instant. His hands found the control yoke without conscious thought. His feet settled on the rudder pedals. His eyes scanned the instruments in a pattern so ingrained it was like breathing. Jesus, he whispered. Feel familiar? Morrison asked. Too familiar. Morrison smiled. Good. That means your muscle memory's intact. Now let's see if your brain remembers what to do with it. He flipped several switches and the simulator came to life. The instruments lit up. The windows filled with a view of a runway stretching out ahead of them, mountains visible in the distance under a clear blue sky. Engine noise filled the cabin, so realistic that Ethan could feel it in his chest. We're cleared for takeoff, Morrison said. When you're ready. Ethan's hands were shaking. He gripped the control yoke tighter, willing them to be steady. Through the observation window, he could see Sophie's face pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with wonder. Being scared means you're about to do something brave. Ethan took a breath. Released the parking brake, advanced the throttles. The simulator lurched forward, the hydraulics creating the sensation of movement so convincing that Ethan's body believed it completely. The runway began to speed past. The airspeed indicator climbed, 40 knots, 60, 80. Rotate, Morrison said calmly. Ethan pulled back on the yoke, and the simulator lifted into the sky. For the first time in 7 years, Captain Ethan Walker was flying again. The world fell away beneath them. Ethan felt it in his bones, the precise moment when the wheels left the runway and the simulator committed to flight. The hydraulic system pitched the cabin upward at exactly the right angle, creating the sensation of climbing through air that didn't exist. The visual display showed the ground dropping away, the runway shrinking to a gray line, the mountains growing larger ahead. His hands moved without conscious thought, adjusting trim, monitoring airspeed, scanning instruments in the eternal pattern drilled into every pilot until it became autonomic. Throttle, attitude, airspeed, altitude, the 4 fundamentals. Everything else was built on top of them. Gear up, Morrison said beside him. Ethan's hand found the gear lever, pulled it. The simulator shuddered slightly as the virtual landing gear retracted into few virtual wheel wells. A green light on the panel turned dark. Flaps up. Another lever, another motion. The aircraft's climb performance improved immediately. Level off at 3,000 feet. Ethan eased back on the throttle, trimmed for level flight, and watched the altimeter wind toward the assigned altitude. 2,900, 2,950, 3,000. He made a tiny adjustment, and the needle settled exactly on the number. Not bad, Morrison said, and there was something in his voice that might have been approval. "How does it feel?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He was too busy processing the flood of sensations, the slight resistance in the control yoke, the sound of the engines at cruise power, the way the artificial horizon showed wings perfectly level against a blue sky that wasn't real, but felt real enough to trick every sense he had. "Strange," he finally said. "Like putting on clothes that used to fit, but you're not sure they still do." "Do they fit?" Ethan made a shallow turn to the left, feeling the simulator bank smoothly, the hydraulics creating the subtle pressure that told his inner ear he was really turning. He rolled out on a new heading, the coordination between his hands and feet so natural it was like the 7 years had never happened. "Yeah," he said quietly, "they fit." In the observation room, Sophie had her face pressed so close to the glass that her breath fogged it. Cassandra stood beside her, watching the simulator through the windows while simultaneously monitoring the data displays that showed every input Ethan was making: control movements, throttle positions, exact flight parameters. "Is he good?" Sophie asked without taking her eyes off the simulator. "He's very good," Cassandra replied. "See how smooth everything is? No overcorrections, no hesitation. That's the mark of real skill." "My dad's the best pilot in the world." Cassandra smiled slightly. "He might be." Back in the simulator, Morrison was increasing the difficulty. "All right, Captain Walker. Let's try some basic maneuvers. Give me a steep turn to the right, 45 degrees of bank, maintain altitude." Ethan rolled into the turn, feeling the simulator heel over as the bank angle increased. The key to a steep turn was power and back pressure. You had to add throttle to maintain airspeed and pull back on the yoke to maintain altitude as the increased bank angle reduced vertical lift. It was a balancing act that separated trained pilots from people who just knew how to keep a plane straight and level. He held the turn for a full 360, the altimeter never wavering more than 20 feet, and rolled out exactly on his original heading. Morrison checked his tablet. Perfect. Airspeed never varied by more than 3 knots. "That's better than most of our students on their first try." He paused. "Hell, that's better than most of our students on their 10th try." "Muscle memory," Ethan said, but he could hear the pride creeping into his voice despite himself. "Muscle memory doesn't account for judgment. Let me throw something at you." Morrison tapped his tablet, and suddenly the left engine's gauges began showing problems. Oil pressure dropping, cylinder head temperature rising, the engine sound changing from smooth to rough. "You've got an engine failure," Morrison announced. "What do you do?" Ethan's response was immediate and automatic. He reduced power on the failing engine, increased power on the good one, used rudder to compensate for the asymmetric thrust, and trimmed the aircraft to maintain level flight on a single engine. "Declare emergency," he said, his voice falling into the calm, professional tone that had seen him through dozens of real emergencies. "Identify the failed engine, verify by reducing power, and seeing if the problem gets worse, feather the prop if possible, secure the fuel and ignition systems. Maintain airspeed above VMC TK, minimum controllable speed, and plan for a single-engine landing." "Where would you land?" Ethan scanned the simulated landscape ahead. "There's an airfield at 2 o'clock, approximately 15 miles. I'd start a descent, set up for a long final approach, and keep my options open in case the second engine fails." Morrison was nodding, making notes on his tablet. "And if the second engine fails?" "Then I'm a glider pilot with a very poor glide ratio. I'd look for the biggest, flattest piece of ground I could find and hope for the best." "Have you ever had a total power loss?" "Twice. Both times I found places to land. Both times I walked away." "Both times in mountains?" "One in mountains, one over water. The water landing was worse." Morrison looked at him with new interest. "I'd like to hear that story sometime." "Maybe," Ethan said, but his tone made it clear that sometime wasn't today. The engine failure scenario resolved when Morrison reset the simulator, the left engine coming back to life with a surge of power that Ethan smoothly integrated back into the flight profile. They ran through more maneuvers, stalls, unusual attitudes, navigation using nothing but basic instruments when Morrison failed the GPS and primary displays. Each time, Ethan's responses were textbook perfect. Not flashy, not showy, but solid and competent and exactly what an experienced pilot should do. His hands never fumbled. His decision-making never hesitated. Captain Walker was emerging from wherever he'd been buried, shaking off 7 years of rust like it was nothing more than dust. After 45 minutes, Morrison called for a break. The simulator's motion systems powered down, and the visual displays froze on a view of mountains and valleys that looked hauntingly like the terrain where Ethan had crashed. "I need to step out for a moment," Morrison said, standing. "Review the flight, check some data. You did good, Captain. Really good." He left, and suddenly Ethan was alone in the simulator, surrounded by instruments and the ghost of his former life. His hands were still on the controls. His feet were still on the rudder pedals. He could smell the electronics and the leather and something else. Sweat, probably his own, because despite the climate control, his shirt was damp. The door opened again. Ethan expected Morrison, but it was Cassandra who stepped inside. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, gesturing to the right seat. "It's your simulator." She settled into the co-pilot seat with surprising comfort, like someone who'd spent time in cockpits before. "I've been watching the data feeds," she said. "Morrison's about to come back here and tell you that you're one of the best pilots he's seen in 20 years of instruction. I wanted to talk to you before that happens." "Why?" "Because I want to know if you're interested. Not if you're capable. We already know you're capable. I want to know if this is something you actually want to do." Ethan looked out the simulator windows at the frozen landscape. "I don't know," he said honestly. "An hour ago, I would have said no, but sitting here flying again, even if it's not real." He trailed off. "It feels right," Cassandra finished. "It feels terrifying, because it does feel right, and I don't know what to do with that." Cassandra was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you a story?" "Do I have a choice?" She smiled. "Not really. When I took over my father's company, everyone said I'd fail. I was too young, too inexperienced, too female for the old boys club that is commercial real estate. And you know what? They were right to be skeptical. I had no idea what I was doing." "You seem to have figured it out." "I did, but not by pretending to be something I wasn't. I figured it out by acknowledging that I was terrified and doing it anyway. By taking the skills I did have and applying them in ways nobody expected. By refusing to let fear make my decisions for me." She turned to look at him directly. "You're scared because you think this might not work out. I get that. But you're also scared because you think it might work out, and then you'll have to acknowledge that you've been hiding from who you really are for 7 years. That's the fear you need to face." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You don't know what it's like to fail at the one thing that defined you." "You're right, I don't. But I know what it's like to be given a second chance and almost throw it away because accepting it felt too risky." She stood. "Morrison's going to offer you a position. Simulator instructor, full-time, starting salary of $85,000 with benefits. You'd train corporate pilots, emergency response teams, and advanced students. Day shift, Monday through Friday, weekends off. $85,000. That was nearly triple what Ethan made as a janitor. That was stability. That was Sophie's college fund. That was a future that looked nothing like the present. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Because 2 nights ago, you saved 12 lives without hesitation. Because you're wasting yourself pushing a mop when you could be teaching people skills that might save dozens more lives down the road. And because," she paused, "because I think everyone deserves a chance to be who they're meant to be." She left before Ethan could respond. Morrison returned a few minutes later, his expression serious. "All right, Captain, I've got one more scenario for you. This one's going to be tough." "How tough?" "Bad weather, multiple system failures, mountain terrain." Morrison's eyes met Ethan's. "Miss Whitmore told me about Mount Rainier, about your crash. If this is too much, just say so. We can stop right now." Ethan's throat was dry. His right shoulder had started to ache, the phantom pain that always came when he thought about that day. Every instinct screamed at him to say yes. Stop. This is too much. But through the observation window, he could see Sophie's face. She was drawing in her notebook, probably sketching the simulator, her expression one of pure concentration and pride. "Run the scenario," Ethan said. Morrison nodded once, respect clear in his eyes. "All right, let's see what you've got." The simulator reset. The clear blue sky disappeared, replaced by heavy clouds and driving rain. Visibility dropped to nearly zero. The mountains appeared through breaks in the weather, jagged peaks that seemed too close, too threatening. "You're on a rescue mission," Morrison narrated, his voice taking on the tone of a scenario briefing. "There are climbers stranded on a ridge at 8,000 feet. Weather moved in faster than forecast. You've got maybe a 20-minute window to get in, pick them up, and get out before conditions become unsurvivable." The simulator's motion system activated, immediately throwing in turbulence that made the cabin shake and pitch. Ethan's hands tightened on the controls. "Your primary navigation system just failed," Morrison continued, and the GPS display went dark. "You're relying on basic instruments and visual reference when you can get it." Ethan's eyes scanned the instruments, building a mental picture of where he was, where he needed to go, what the terrain around him looked like. The altimeter showed 7,200 feet. The heading indicator showed northwest. The airspeed was fluctuating wildly as wind shear caught the aircraft. "I need a heading to the landing zone," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. 345 magnetic. Distance 4 miles. Ridge elevation 7,900 feet. Ethan turned to the new heading, climbing to clear the ridge. The turbulence worsened, the simulator pitching and rolling with sickening realism. Rain hammered the windscreen. Lightning flashed in the clouds. This was exactly like Mount Rainier. The weather, the terrain, the desperate race against time and nature. The only difference was that 7 years ago, there had been real lives at stake. Now it was just data and hydraulics and his own demons. "Left engine's losing power," Morrison announced. The left engine's RPM began to drop, the sound changing, the aircraft yawing to the left. Ethan compensated immediately, adding right rudder, adjusting power, maintaining altitude, and heading through sheer force of will and muscle memory. His shoulder screamed in protest at the control inputs. Sweat ran down his face. "Landing zone ahead," Morrison said. "You've got one approach, maybe two if you're lucky. The weather's closing in fast." Ethan could see it through the rain. A narrow ridge, barely wide enough for an aircraft, surrounded by peaks that would kill him if he strayed off course by even a few hundred feet. This was insane. This was impossible. This was exactly the kind of approach that had ended his career 7 years ago. He started the descent. The wind tried to kill him. It came from every direction at once, updrafts and downdrafts and crosswinds that made the aircraft buck like a living thing. The left engine coughed and sputtered. The right engine was running at maximum power just to maintain airspeed. 50 feet above the ridge. 40 feet. 30. "You're too fast," Morrison said calmly. "You'll overshoot the landing zone." Ethan pulled power, added flaps, felt the aircraft's descent rate increase. 20 feet. 15. "Too slow now. You'll stall." Ethan added power, decreased the descent rate. The ridge was rushing up at him, rocks and snow in a tiny flat area that looked far too small to land on. 10 feet. 5. The simulator's wheels touched down hard, the motion system slamming the cabin with the impact. Ethan stood on the brakes, fighting to stop the aircraft before it ran out of ridge. The simulator jerked to a halt with maybe 30 feet to spare. For a moment, there was only silence, except for the sound of simulated rain and Ethan's ragged breathing. Then Morrison spoke. "Well, that was something." Ethan's hands were shaking so badly he had to pull them off the controls and clench them in his lap. His shoulder was on fire. His heart was hammering. He felt like he might throw up. "How did I do?" he managed to ask. Morrison consulted his tablet, scrolling through data. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. "You want the technical assessment or the honest one?" "Both." "Technically, you made several minor errors. You were 50 feet high on final approach. Your airspeed control during the descent was inconsistent. You landed harder than optimal, which in a real aircraft might have damaged the landing gear." Ethan nodded, feeling the familiar weight of failure settling on his shoulders. "But honestly," Morrison continued, and now he was smiling, "that was one of the most impressive pieces of flying I've seen in this simulator. The conditions I put you in would have crashed 95% of pilots. You not only survived, you got the aircraft on the ground in a landing zone that most people wouldn't even attempt. Your decision-making was sound. Your control inputs were appropriate. And you never gave up, even when the scenario was designed to make you fail." Ethan stared at him. "I didn't fail." Captain Walker, you just flew through conditions that simulate the worst-case scenario we use to test emergency response pilots. And you nailed it. Morrison stood, extending his hand. If you're interested, I'd be honored to have you as an instructor here. Ethan shook his hand, still trying to process what had just happened. He hadn't failed, he hadn't crashed. He'd made it through the nightmare scenario that was basically a recreation of the worst day of his life. And he'd succeeded. The door to the simulator opened and Sophie burst in, followed more slowly by Cassandra. The girl threw herself at Ethan, wrapping her arms around him. "Dad, that was amazing," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "You were flying through the storm, and the engine broke, and you still landed. It was like a movie." Ethan hugged her back, his eyes meeting Cassandra's over Sophie's head. The CEO was smiling, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "So?" Cassandra asked. "What do you think?" Ethan looked at Morrison, who nodded encouragingly. He looked at Sophie, whose face was shining with pride and excitement. He looked at the simulator controls, at the instruments that had responded to his touch like old friends, at the frozen display showing the ridge where he'd landed. He thought about 7 years of pushing a mop, 7 years of being invisible, 7 years of telling himself that Captain Walker was dead and gone. But Captain Walker wasn't dead. He'd just been sleeping. "When do I start?" Ethan asked. Sophie squealed and hugged him tighter. Morrison grinned and clapped him on the shoulder, the left one, thankfully. And Cassandra's smile widened. "How about Monday?" she said. "I need to give notice at my current job." "Consider it done. I'll handle the transition." Cassandra pulled out her phone, already typing. "HR will contact you this afternoon with the formal offer. You'll need to complete some paperwork, pass a background check, standard stuff. Morrison will set up your training schedule." "Training schedule?" Ethan asked. "I thought I just passed the test." Morrison laughed. "You passed the flying test. Now you need to learn how to teach. There's a difference between being a good pilot and being a good instructor. We'll spend the next 2 weeks getting you up to speed on our curriculum, our teaching methods, and our safety protocols." "Paid training," Cassandra added. "Full salary starts today." Ethan felt dizzy. This morning he'd been a janitor. Now he was a simulator instructor with a salary that would change everything, working in a field he'd thought was closed to him forever. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "Say you'll make us proud," Cassandra replied. "Say you'll take the second chance you deserve and run with it." Sophie tugged on Ethan's sleeve. "Can we celebrate? Can we go out for dinner, somewhere nice?" Ethan looked at his daughter, at the joy radiating from her, and felt something inside him finally, completely break free. The fear was still there. The doubt was still there. But underneath it all was something he hadn't felt in 7 years. Hope. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yeah, we can go somewhere nice." They left the simulator, Morrison heading off to process the session data, while Cassandra led Ethan and Sophie back through the facility. Other instructors and students stopped to stare at the janitor. Former janitor, Ethan corrected himself, walking with the CEO like they were equals. Because now they were. In the car on the way home, Sophie chattered nonstop about the simulator, about how cool it was, about how she'd drawn 5 different pictures of Ethan flying. Ethan half listened, his mind still processing everything that had happened. His phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Chen, who somehow already knew what had happened. The woman had an intelligence network that would impress the CIA. "Sophie told me. I'm proud of you. Don't screw this up." Ethan smiled and typed back, "I'll try not to." Another text, this one from Marcus at the tower. "Heard you're leaving us. Congrats, man. You deserve it." Word traveled fast in the building, apparently. When they got home, Ethan made good on his promise and took Sophie to the nicest restaurant he could afford. A steakhouse downtown where the prices made him wince, but Sophie's excitement made it worth every penny. She ordered the biggest steak on the menu and chocolate cake for dessert, and Ethan didn't say no to anything. "Dad?" Sophie said between bites of cake, her face serious. "Are you happy?" Ethan considered the question. Was he happy? He was terrified. He was excited. He was anxious about starting something new at 32 years old. He was worried about failing, about disappointing people, about discovering that this second chance was a mistake. But underneath all of that, yes, he was happy. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said. I'm happy. Good, because you haven't looked happy in a really long time. Not since Mom. The words hit him square in the chest. He'd thought he'd been hiding it well, thought Sophie was too young to notice the weight he'd been carrying, the grief and the loss, and the slow surrender to a life that was safe but empty. But of course she'd noticed. Sophie noticed everything. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Don't be sorry. Just stay happy. Sophie reached across the table and took his hand. Mom would want you to be happy. She told me so, before she died. She said I had to make sure you didn't forget how to smile. Ethan felt tears prick at his eyes. Emily had known. She'd known that he would struggle, that he would bury himself in grief and responsibility and lose sight of who he was. And she'd given their daughter the job of pulling him back. Your mom was pretty smart, he managed to say. I know, Sophie said simply. That's why you married her. They finished dinner and went home, where Ethan tucked Sophie into bed and listened to her excited recap of the day for the third time. When she finally fell asleep, he sat in the living room of their small apartment and looked at the photographs on the wall. Most of them were of Sophie at various ages, birthdays, school events, random moments captured on his phone and printed because Emily had always insisted that memories should exist outside of devices. But there was one photo that Ethan had kept in a drawer for 7 years, too painful to look at. He got it out now. It showed him in his flight suit standing next to a helicopter, grinning at the camera. Emily had taken it the day he'd been promoted to captain. He'd been so proud, so certain that he knew who he was and where his life was going. That certainty had died on Mount Rainier, but maybe, just maybe, it was starting to come back. Ethan's phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered anyway. Captain Walker? A male voice, vaguely familiar. Speaking? This is David Chen. I was the pilot on November 7-3 Tango Whiskey, the plane you helped 2 nights ago. Ethan sat up straighter. Oh, hello. I wanted to call and thank you personally. What you did, the pilot's voice cracked slightly. You saved our lives, all of us. The passengers, my co-pilot, the crew. We would have died in those mountains if you hadn't talked us through. I'm glad I could help. Miss Whitmore told me you're going to be teaching at the simulator facility. I wanted you to know that when I have students, I'm going to tell them your story. About the janitor who remembered how to fly when it mattered most. About staying calm in a crisis. About never giving up your skills even when life takes them away from you. Ethan didn't know what to say to that. Thank you, Chen continued. Thank you for giving me the chance to see my family again. Thank you for being there when we needed someone who knew what to do. Just thank you. After they hung up, Ethan sat in the darkness of his living room for a long time, the photograph of Captain Walker still in his hand. He wasn't that person anymore. Too much had happened. Too much had changed. He couldn't go back to being the fearless rescue pilot who flew into storms without hesitation. But maybe he didn't need to go back. Maybe he could go forward instead, taking the pieces of Captain Walker that still existed and building something new with them. Something that included Sophie and teaching and a different kind of flying. Something that was scared but brave anyway. Something that looked a lot like hope. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel possible. Ethan stood outside the Whitmore Aviation Training Center at 7:43 a.m., wearing khaki pants and a button-down shirt that Sophie had insisted he iron twice because first days are important, Dad. His old leather messenger bag, a gift from Emily that had survived countless flights and 7 years of neglect, hung from his shoulder, containing a notebook, pens, and the employee handbook HR had emailed him over the weekend. He'd read the handbook 3 times, memorizing policies and procedures like they were pre-flight checklists, trying to convince himself that he belonged here, that this wasn't some elaborate mistake that would unravel the moment he walked through those doors. His phone buzzed, a text from Sophie, sent from Mrs. Chen's tablet before school. Good luck, Dad. You're going to be amazing. D, I love you. Ethan smiled and typed back, Love you too, sweetheart. Have a great day at school. Another text, this one from Mrs. Chen herself. Don't overthink it. Just be yourself, the good self, not the scared self. Ethan pocketed his phone and walked inside. The lobby was bustling with activity that he'd missed during his early morning simulator session. Young pilots in training moved between classrooms, their conversations filled with technical jargon and nervous laughter. Instructors carried coffee cups and flight manuals, greeting each other with the easy familiarity of people who work together every day. Through the windows, Ethan could see aircraft on the tarmac beyond. Small training planes, corporate jets, even a helicopter or two. This was a different world from pushing a mop through empty hallways. This was a world he'd thought was lost to him forever. "Captain Walker!" Ethan turned to see Morrison approaching, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing a flight instructor's uniform identical to the one Ethan had been issued over the weekend. The older man handed him one of the cups. "Black, no sugar, right? Cassandra mentioned that's how you take it." "She remembers that?" Cassandra remembers everything. It's terrifying. Morrison gestured toward a hallway. "Come on, I'll show you to your office first, then we'll start your orientation." "I have an office?" "Every instructor gets one. Nothing fancy, but it's yours." They walked through corridors that Ethan was beginning to recognize, past the simulator bay where he'd proven himself, past classrooms where students were already settling in for morning lectures. Morrison stopped at a door with a nameplate that read Captain E. "Walker, flight instructor." Ethan stared at the nameplate, his throat tight. Captain E. Walker. Words he hadn't seen attached to his name in 7 years. "You okay?" Morrison asked. "Yeah, just... It's been a while." The office was small but functional. A desk, a chair, filing cabinets, a computer, and a window that overlooked the airfield. On the desk was a welcome packet, a training schedule, and a framed photograph that made Ethan's breath catch. It was the photo from his living room, him in his flight suit, standing next to the helicopter, grinning at the camera. He'd never sent that photo to anyone at Whitmore, which meant Cassandra had somehow found it and placed it here, a reminder of who he'd been and who he was becoming again. "She really does think of everything," Ethan murmured. Morrison smiled. "That she does. Now, let's talk about what your first week looks like." The orientation was overwhelming in the best possible way. Morrison walked Ethan through the training center's philosophy, curriculum structure, and safety protocols. They discussed teaching methods, how to handle difficult students, how to design scenarios that challenged without discouraging, how to debrief after simulator sessions in ways that reinforced learning rather than crushing confidence. "The hardest part isn't the technical knowledge," Morrison explained as they sat in his office, surrounded by aviation charts and photos of aircraft. "You've already got that in spades. The hardest part is learning to let students make mistakes." "What do you mean?" "When you're in the simulator with a student who's about to screw up, every instinct you have as a pilot will scream at you to take over, to fix it before it becomes a problem. But you can't do that. You have to let them make the mistake, within safe parameters, of course, so they can learn from it. That's the difference between flying and teaching." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding. You have to watch them fail. You have to watch them struggle. Sometimes they fail, sometimes they don't. But either way, they learn more from working through the problem themselves than they ever would from you solving it for them. They spent the rest of the morning reviewing the current student roster. Ethan would be working with 3 groups initially: corporate pilots getting recurrent training, emergency medical helicopter crews, and a group of young aviators working toward their commercial licenses. Each group had different needs, different skill levels, different fears to overcome. "Your first session is tomorrow," Morrison said, pulling up a file on his computer. 2 corporate pilots, both experienced, just need their annual simulator check. Should be straightforward. "I'll observe, give you feedback afterward." "What if I mess up?" Morrison leaned back in his chair. "Then you'll mess up, and we'll figure out what went wrong, and you'll do better next time. That's how teaching works. Nobody expects perfection on day 1. At noon, Morrison took Ethan to the instructor's lounge, a comfortable space with couches, a kitchenette, and windows overlooking the airfield. 6 other instructors were there, eating lunch and swapping stories. They looked up when Ethan entered, conversations pausing as they sized him up. Morrison made introductions. "Everyone, this is Ethan Walker. He's joining our team as a simulator instructor. Ethan, this motley crew represents the finest aviation educators you'll ever meet, which tells you more about the state of aviation education than it does about them." There was laughter, and then the instructors came forward, one by one, to shake Ethan's hand. Captain Sarah Rodriguez, who specialized in emergency procedures, Captain Tom Brennan, who taught instrument flying, Captain Lisa Yamamoto, who ran the helicopter simulator program, others whose names Ethan tried to memorize but knew he'd mix up for at least a week. "So you're the janitor," Rodriguez said, not unkindly. "We heard about what you did, talking down that plane in the storm." "I just gave them a heading," Ethan said, the automatic response. "Morrison says you're one of the best natural pilots he's tested in 20 years, Brennan added. "That's high praise. Jim doesn't compliment anyone." Morrison shrugged. "I call it like I see it." They ate lunch together, the conversation flowing easily around topics Ethan understood: weather patterns, aircraft systems, close calls, and lessons learned. For the first time in 7 years, he was part of a community that spoke his language, that understood what it meant to trust your life to physics and skill and careful decision-making 30,000 feet above the ground. He was home. That evening, Ethan picked up Sophie from school himself for the first time in recent memory. Usually, Mrs. Chen handled pickup because Ethan was sleeping after his night shift, but now, with normal hours, he could be there when the final bell rang, could watch his daughter come running out with her backpack bouncing and her hair flying. "Dad," she shouted, throwing herself at him. "How was it? Tell me everything." "I will, but first, how was your day?" "Boring. We learned about fractions again. I already know fractions. Now tell me about your day." They walked to the car, a 10-year-old sedan that ran more on hope than mechanics, and Ethan recounted his orientation while Sophie listened with the intensity of someone hearing an adventure story. She asked questions about the simulators, the other instructors, whether he'd gotten to fly again. "Not today. Tomorrow I observe my first real teaching session. Then Wednesday I teach my own." "Are you nervous?" "Terrified." "That means you're about to do something brave," Sophie said automatically, and Ethan laughed. "Your mom really drilled that into you, didn't she?" "She drilled it into both of us. You just forgot for a while." Ethan reached over and squeezed her hand. "I'm remembering now." They stopped at the grocery store on the way home, and Ethan realized with a start that he could afford the good brand of peanut butter now, could buy fresh fruit instead of canned, could say yes when Sophie asked if they could get ice cream for dessert. The financial anxiety that had been his constant companion for 7 years was beginning to loosen its grip, not gone entirely, but no longer quite so suffocating. At home, while Sophie did homework at the kitchen table, Ethan prepared dinner, real dinner, not just pasta or sandwiches, but chicken and vegetables, and a salad. He moved around the kitchen with a lightness he hadn't felt in years, humming tunelessly, occasionally looking over at Sophie, who was chewing on her pencil and frowning at math problems. This was what he'd been missing. Not just the financial stability or the meaningful work, but the simple ability to be present in his own life instead of just surviving it. His phone rang. Cassandra's name appeared on the screen. "Hello? Captain Walker, how was day 1? "Good. Really good. Morrison's been great, the other instructors are welcoming, and I have my first real session tomorrow." "I know. I've been monitoring your schedule." Of course she had. "I wanted to check in, make sure you have everything you need." "I do. Thank you. And thank you for the photograph in my office. I don't know how you found it, but I have my sources," Cassandra said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Listen, I'm calling because I want to invite you and Sophie to dinner this weekend. Nothing formal, just a chance to celebrate your new position properly." Ethan hesitated. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to. I want to. Besides, Sophie called my office this afternoon. Apparently she charmed my assistant into giving her my direct number and personally invited me. How could I say no to that?" Ethan looked at his daughter, who was suddenly very focused on her homework and definitely not eavesdropping. "She called you?" "She's very persuasive. I can see where she gets it from." "I don't think I've ever been accused of being persuasive." "You persuaded me to give a janitor a 6-figure job after one conversation. I'd call that persuasive." Cassandra paused. "Saturday at 7. I'll text you the address. And Ethan, bring that good self Mrs. Chen mentioned. Leave the scared one at home." She hung up before he could ask how she knew about Mrs. Chen's text. Tuesday morning brought Ethan's first real test, observing Morrison teach a simulator session. Two corporate pilots, both in their 40s, both confident to the point of cockiness, settled into the simulator while Morrison handled the briefing. Ethan watched from the observation room, taking notes on everything Morrison did, how he explained the scenario without giving away the challenges, how he let the pilots discuss their strategy before starting, how he remained silent during the actual flight until a critical teaching moment arose. The scenario involved an engine failure on takeoff, the most dangerous time for such a failure because there's no altitude to recover, no time to think, just immediate action or immediate disaster. The pilot flying responded well initially, maintaining control, following procedures. But then he started to climb, trying to gain altitude on one engine, and Ethan could see the airspeed dropping dangerously low. Morrison let it continue for another 3 seconds before speaking. "What's your airspeed, Captain?" The pilot glanced at his instruments, and Ethan saw the moment he realized his mistake. Too slow, almost to the stall speed, the aircraft on the edge of becoming uncontrollable. "Lowering the nose," the pilot said immediately, pushing forward on the yoke to regain speed even though it meant descending. "Good," Morrison said calmly. "Talk me through your thinking." "I was trying to climb. Thought I could clear the obstacles ahead, but I forgot the first rule, fly the airplane. Airspeed is life. Altitude without speed is useless." "Exactly. What would have happened if you'd stalled?" "We'd be in an uncontrolled descent with one engine and probably wouldn't recover." "So what did you learn?" "That I got complacent. I know better than that. I just got focused on the wrong priority." Morrison nodded and let them continue the scenario. Afterward, during the debrief, he reviewed the mistake without judgment, framing it as a learning opportunity rather than a failure. The pilot left the session not defensive or embarrassed, but thoughtful and engaged. "That's how it's done," Morrison told Ethan afterward. "You let them make the mistake in a safe environment, you help them understand why it was a mistake, and you send them away better than they arrived. The ego hit is temporary. The lesson lasts forever." Wednesday arrived with Ethan's first solo teaching session. The student was a young woman named Jennifer Park, 24 years old, working toward her commercial license. Her file showed she was technically proficient but struggled with confidence, especially during emergency scenarios. Ethan met her in the briefing room, his heart pounding, trying to remember everything Morrison had taught him about teaching while simultaneously fighting the urge to run away. "Captain Walker?" Jennifer extended her hand, professional but clearly nervous. "It's an honor to work with you. I heard what you did with that corporate jet during the storm." "Please call me Ethan, and that was mostly luck." "Morrison says there's no such thing as luck in aviation, just preparation meeting opportunity." Ethan smiled despite his nerves. "Morrison says a lot of things. Most of them are right." They spent 20 minutes reviewing the day's scenario. Jennifer would be practicing crosswind landings, an essential skill that many pilots found challenging. Ethan explained the theory, demonstrated the control inputs on a whiteboard, answered her questions without giving away all the solutions. Then they climbed into the simulator. Ethan settled into the instructor's seat, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. This was different from flying. When he flew, he only had to trust himself. Now he had to trust someone else, had to watch them struggle, had to resist the urge to take over. The scenario started with Jennifer doing well, her first 2 landings solid, if not spectacular. Then Ethan increased the crosswind, pushing her comfort zone, and watched her techniques begin to break down. She was over-controlling, fighting the aircraft instead of working with it, her approaches becoming increasingly unstable. Ethan's hands itched to grab the controls. Every instinct screamed that she was about to crash, that he needed to intervene, that letting this continue was dangerous even in a simulator. But Morrison's voice echoed in his head, "Let them struggle. Let them learn." So Ethan stayed silent, watching Jennifer wrestle with the crosswind, watching her make mistakes and correct them, watching her work through the problem herself. On her 6th approach, something clicked. Her inputs became smoother, more coordinated. She stopped fighting and started flying. The landing was nearly perfect. "How did that feel?" Ethan asked. Jennifer was breathing hard, adrenaline evident in her voice. "Terrifying, but also, I actually felt it that time. Felt what you meant about letting the wind do some of the work." That's the key. The wind isn't your enemy. It's just another variable to manage. They ran through more scenarios, and Ethan found himself relaxing into the teaching role. Jennifer responded well to his coaching, asked intelligent questions, and most importantly, showed visible improvement over the course of the session. During the debrief, Ethan reviewed her performance, highlighting what she'd done well before addressing areas for improvement. He watched her posture change from defensive to engaged, saw her taking notes, saw her nodding as concepts connected. "Thank you," she said at the end. "I've had other instructors who just criticized without explaining. You actually helped me understand." After she left, Ethan sat alone in the simulator, still processing what had just happened. He'd taught someone, actually taught them, not just demonstrated or explained, but helped them improve in a measurable way. Morrison appeared in the doorway. "I watched from the observation room. You did good, Ethan. Really good. You let her struggle exactly the right amount, intervened at exactly the right moments, and sent her away better than she arrived. I almost took over during that fourth approach. She was so unstable. But you didn't, and because you didn't, she figured it out herself. That's a lesson she'll remember." The weeks that followed developed a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Ethan would wake up at a reasonable hour, have breakfast with Sophie, drive her to school, head to the training center. He'd teach simulator sessions, observe other instructors, attend staff meetings, study curriculum materials. Then he'd pick up Sophie from school, help with homework, make dinner, spend the evening actually present, instead of sleeping in preparation for a night shift. The work was challenging in ways he hadn't expected. Each student was different, with unique strengths and weaknesses and fears. Some needed encouragement, others needed tough love. A few needed someone to believe in them when they'd stopped believing in themselves. Ethan found himself drawing on his own experiences more than he'd anticipated. When a student froze during an emergency scenario, paralyzed by fear of making the wrong decision, Ethan would talk about Mount Rainier, not the crash itself, which he still couldn't discuss, but the moments of clarity that came from accepting you couldn't control everything and doing the best you could with what you had. When a cocky pilot got humbled by a challenging scenario, Ethan would remind them that confidence was essential, but complacency was deadly, that the day you thought you knew everything was the day aviation would teach you how wrong you were. And when a student succeeded, when Ethan watched them nail a difficult approach or handle an emergency with skill and calm, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride. Not in himself, but in helping someone else become better. 1 month in, Morrison called Ethan into his office. "I've been reviewing your performance evaluations," the older instructor said, gesturing for Ethan to sit. "Student feedback, peer observations, my own assessments." Ethan's stomach tightened. "And?" Morrison smiled. "And you're exceeding every expectation we had. Your students are showing marked improvement. Your teaching style is effective, and you've integrated into the team like you've been here for years instead of weeks. I still feel like I'm faking it sometimes. That's called imposter syndrome. It means you care about doing well. The day you stop feeling that way is the day you should worry." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "I'm recommending you for advanced instructor certification. It would allow you to teach more complex scenarios, work with emergency response crews, potentially develop new curriculum." "Already? I've only been here a month." "Some people take years to reach this level. You got here in weeks because you're not learning to be a pilot. You already are one. You're just learning to share what you know, and you're a natural at it." Ethan left Morrison's office feeling lighter than air. He called Sophie from his car before driving to pick her up, needing to share the news with someone. "That's amazing, Dad," she said, her voice crackling slightly through Mrs. Chen's tablet speaker. "I told you you'd be great." "You did. I should listen to you more often." "You should listen to me always. I'm very smart." "Where do you get your confidence?" "From Mom. And from you, when you remember who you are." That weekend, they went to dinner at Cassandra's house, a stunning modern home in the hills overlooking the city, all glass and steel and views that probably cost more than Ethan would make in a lifetime. Sophie was awestruck, running from window to window, commenting on everything she saw. Cassandra greeted them warmly, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than Ethan's car but made her seem more approachable than the corporate power suits. She'd cooked, actually cooked, not catered, a meal that was simple but perfect. Over dinner, they talked about everything and nothing. Sophie dominated the conversation, telling Cassandra about school and her friends, and her dreams of becoming either an artist or a pilot or possibly both. Cassandra listened with genuine interest, asking questions, laughing at Sophie's jokes, treating the 9-year-old like an equal. After Sophie had been settled in the living room with a movie and enough snacks to supply a small army, Cassandra and Ethan sat on the deck overlooking the city lights. "She's wonderful," Cassandra said, sipping wine. "You're raising an incredible kid." "I'm trying. Most days I feel like I'm just barely keeping up." "That's called being a parent. My mother used to say that the moment you think you have it figured out is the moment your child changes all the rules." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city sparkle below them. "I never thanked you properly," Ethan said finally, "for what you did. For seeing something in me when I'd stopped seeing it in myself. For giving me a chance when you had no reason to." Cassandra turned to look at him. "I had every reason. You saved 12 lives without hesitation. That told me everything I needed to know about who you are. I was just a janitor who remembered some emergency procedures. You were a pilot who refused to let his past define his future. There's a difference." She paused. "Can I tell you something? That night in the lobby, when you took the phone from my hand and started talking to that plane, that was the first time in 5 years I'd seen someone do something without calculating the cost first. No hesitation, no thought for consequences, just pure instinct to help. It reminded me why I got into this business in the first place." "Why did you get into it?" "Because my father built an empire by crushing people, by viewing employees as resources to be exploited and competitors as enemies to be destroyed. I took over his company because I wanted to prove you could build something meaningful without destroying everything around you." She smiled slightly. "Some days I succeed. Some days I wonder if I'm just a different version of the same thing. You gave a janitor a 6-figure job. That's not something your father would have done. No, he would have seen you as someone to be used and discarded when you were no longer useful. That's why I had to be different." They talked until late, the conversation flowing easily. Two people who'd started as strangers and somehow become something like friends. When Ethan finally gathered a sleepy Sophie and drove home, he felt a contentment that had nothing to do with salary or job titles and everything to do with connection. 3 months into his new position, Ethan was asked to develop a new training scenario. Morrison wanted something that would challenge experienced pilots, something based on real-world emergencies that would test decision-making under pressure. Ethan knew exactly what scenario to create. He'd been avoiding it for 3 months, but now it felt right. Necessary, even. He built a simulator program that recreated the conditions of Mount Rainier. The weather, the terrain, the multiple system failures, the impossible choices. He flew through it himself dozens of times, fine-tuning the variables, making it challenging but survivable for someone with the right skills and judgment. When he finally presented it to Morrison, the older instructor reviewed the scenario parameters in silence, his expression unreadable. "This is based on your crash," Morrison said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "That's a hell of a thing to face." "I know, but I've run through it enough times now that I can teach it, and I think it's valuable. This is the kind of scenario that separates pilots who've been properly trained from pilots who just have certifications." Morrison studied him for a long moment. "All right, let's test it. I'll fly it first, give you feedback." They went to the simulator together. Ethan set up the scenario while Morrison reviewed the parameters, asking questions about decision points and failure modes. Then the older instructor climbed into the pilot's seat, and Ethan started the program. Morrison flew it well, better than well. He made smart decisions, managed the aircraft skillfully, and ultimately got the simulated climbers off the mountain and the aircraft to safety. When the scenario ended, he sat in silence for a moment before speaking. "That's brutal," he said quietly. "The margins for error are razor thin. One wrong decision and you're dead." "That's what it was like," Ethan said. "Except when I flew it for real, I made wrong decisions. I pushed when I should have waited. I tried to thread a needle that couldn't be threaded, and I got lucky enough to survive my mistakes." "You saved everyone on that aircraft?" "I crashed. Saving everyone doesn't erase that I crashed." Morrison turned to look at him. "Ethan, you landed an aircraft with multiple system failures in mountain terrain during a storm. The fact that you crashed is less important than the fact that everyone walked away. That's not luck. That's skill. It didn't feel like skill at the time. It never does. Every pilot who survived a serious emergency will tell you they felt like they were failing right up until the moment they realized they'd succeeded. Morrison climbed out of the simulator. This scenario is good, really good. It's going to challenge pilots in ways they haven't been challenged before, and it's going to teach them lessons that might save lives someday. They implemented the Mount Rainier scenario the following week. Ethan watched pilot after pilot attempt it, saw them struggle with the same choices he'd struggled with, saw them make different decisions that led to different outcomes. Some succeeded, some failed and had to discuss what went wrong. And slowly, painfully, Ethan began to forgive himself for crashing 7 years ago. 6 months into his new position, Ethan was asked to speak at a regional aviation safety conference. Morrison had volunteered him without asking, claiming that Ethan's perspective as both a rescue pilot and an instructor would be valuable. Ethan stood at the podium in front of 200 aviation professionals and told them about the night a janitor answered a distress call, about rediscovering skills he thought were lost, about learning that failure didn't have to be fatal, that crashes could be survived, that second chances existed for people willing to take them. The standing ovation surprised him. The pilots who approached afterward to share their own stories of second chances and redemption surprised him more. One of them was David Chen, the pilot from November 73 Tango Whiskey. "I told you I'd tell people your story," Chen said, shaking Ethan's hand. "I've told it to every student I've flown with since that night, about staying calm, about never giving up your training, about being ready when someone needs you. I appreciate that." "No, thank you. My daughter turned 4 last month. I got to be there for her birthday because of you." Chen's voice was thick with emotion. "That matters more than you know." That evening, Ethan picked up Sophie from Mrs. Chen's apartment, where she'd been staying during the conference, and took her to the training center. It was after hours, the facility mostly empty, perfect for what he wanted to do. "Why are we here?" Sophie asked as they walked through the quiet corridors. "Because there's something I want to show you, something I've been working on." He led her to the simulator bay, where the massive machine sat silent and waiting. Sophie's eyes went wide. "Can I go inside?" "You can do better than that. You can fly." Her expression transformed from curiosity to pure joy. "Really? Really, really? Really, really?" Ethan helped her into the left seat, adjusting it so she could reach the pedals, showing her the basic controls without overwhelming her with technical details. Then he settled into the right seat and started the simulator. The view outside the window showed a simple landscape, clear skies, flat terrain, a runway stretching out ahead. No storms, no emergencies, no challenges beyond the basic mechanics of flight. "Put your hands on the yoke," Ethan instructed. "Feel how it moves." Sophie gripped the control yoke with both hands, her face serious with concentration. Ethan placed his hands over hers, gentle and guiding. "When you're ready, we're going to push the throttles forward and the plane will start moving. Then when I tell you, you're going to pull back very gently and we'll take off, okay?" "Okay." Ethan advanced the throttles. The simulator began to move, the runway speeding past. Sophie's eyes were huge, her breathing quick with excitement. "A little more speed," Ethan said calmly. "Almost there, and now. Pull back just a little." Sophie pulled back on the yoke, Ethan's hands guiding hers, and the simulator lifted into the air. The ground fell away beneath them. The horizon opened up, the sky spread out in every direction. Sophie laughed, a sound of pure, unfiltered joy that made Ethan's eyes sting with tears. "I'm flying!" she shouted. "Dad, I'm flying!" "You are," Ethan confirmed, his voice rough. "You're doing great, sweetheart." They flew together for 20 minutes, Sophie's hands on the controls with Ethan guiding her, making gentle turns and climbs and descents. She peppered him with questions about every instrument, every control, every aspect of the aircraft. And Ethan answered each one, sharing the knowledge that had defined his life, passing it on to his daughter. When they finally landed, Sophie's first landing, guided but still hers, she turned to him with tears streaming down her face. "That was the best thing ever," she said. "Can we do it again?" "We can do it as many times as you want. I work here now, remember?" Sophie unbuckled and threw her arms around him. "Thank you, Dad. Thank you for remembering how to fly. Thank you for being happy again. Thank you for being you." Ethan held his daughter and let himself cry. For Emily, who wasn't here to see this, for the 7 years he'd spent being invisible, for the crash that had defined him for so long, for the second chance that had seemed impossible until it wasn't. "I love you, Sophie," he whispered into her hair. "I love you too, Dad. So much." 1 year after the night in the lobby, Ethan stood in Cassandra's office overlooking the city. The rain was falling again, gentle this time, washing the streets clean. Somewhere out there, people were going about their lives, making decisions, taking chances, trying to become who they were meant to be. "Morrison's retiring next year," Cassandra said, standing beside him at the window. "He's recommending you to take over as director of the simulator program." Ethan turned to stare at her. "What?" "You've been here a year. Your student evaluations are the highest in the department. You've developed 3 new training scenarios that are being adopted by other facilities. You've proven you can lead, can teach, can inspire." She smiled. "Morrison says you're ready. I agree. I'm not qualified to run a program. You're just one of the finest pilots and teachers I've ever seen. Stop selling yourself short." Cassandra's expression softened. "A year ago, you were a janitor who thought Captain Walker was dead. Look at yourself now. Look at what you've built." Ethan looked out at the city, at the lights coming on as evening fell, at the world that had seemed so dark a year ago and now seemed full of possibility. "I still get scared," he admitted. "I still wonder if I'm good enough. That's called being human. The trick is being scared and doing it anyway." She paused. "A wise little girl told me that once. Something about being scared meaning you're about to do something brave." Ethan laughed. "Sophie's going to be running the world someday." "Probably. I'm considering hiring her as a consultant. She's got better instincts than half my executive team." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the rain, watching the city, watching time pass in the way it does when you're finally living instead of just surviving. "I'll take the position," Ethan said finally. "On one condition." "Name it." "I want to establish a scholarship program for people who want to fly but can't afford training, people who work night shifts and think their dreams are dead, people who need someone to believe in them." Cassandra's smile widened. "I'll have legal draw up the paperwork. How much are you thinking?" "Start with $500,000, see where it goes from there." "Done." "Anything else?" "Yeah, thank you for everything. For seeing me when I was invisible. For giving me a chance when you had no reason to. For reminding me who I was supposed to be." Cassandra extended her hand. Ethan shook it. "Thank you for answering that call sign," she said quietly. "For being brave when it mattered. For proving that second chances are real." That night, Ethan sat with Sophie at their kitchen table, helping her with homework that had progressed from fractions to pre-algebra. She was struggling with a problem, her face scrunched in concentration, her pencil moving across the page in the same determined way she approached everything in life. "Dad," she said suddenly, looking up, "are you happy now? Really happy?" Ethan thought about the question. He thought about the year that had passed, about simulator sessions and teaching moments and students who'd become better pilots because of him. He thought about no longer being invisible, about Sophie's face when she'd flown for the first time, about Emily's voice telling him to remember how to smile. He thought about Captain Walker, who wasn't dead after all, just sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said, and meant it completely. "I'm really happy." "Good." Sophie went back to her math problem, solved it triumphantly, and then added, "Because tomorrow we're going flying again, right? You promised." "I promised. After school, we'll go to the training center and you can practice takeoffs." "Best dad ever," Sophie declared, and went back to her homework. Ethan sat there in their small apartment, listening to his daughter hum while she worked, watching rain streak the windows, feeling the weight of a year's worth of change settle into something like peace. The janitor who'd answered a call sign was gone. In his place was a teacher, a father, a pilot who'd learned that crashes could be survived and second chances could be earned and invisible people could become visible again if someone took the time to see them. And years from now, when pilots told stories about their training, some would mention the quiet instructor who'd once worked nights cleaning floors, who'd talked a plane out of the sky during a storm, who taught them that being scared just meant you were about to do something brave. They'd remember him not as the man who crashed, but as the man who kept flying anyway. That was enough. That was everything. That was home.